Good morning, everyone. It's 9:05, and I think we have at least 360 participants to today's virtual town hall discussion on the second day of the Pilipinas Conference for 2021. This is in partnership with the European Union Delegation, and we focus on the Philippine Trade Relations in the pandemic context, part of EU-Philippines trade and sustainability discussions for 2021. I am Dindo Manhit. I'm the president of Stratbase ADRI, and I welcome everyone. I especially welcome our speakers, esteemed speakers coming from different business associations, representing the leadership of different business associations, both local and foreign. And I also welcome key thinkers who will offer views with regards to trade and sustainability issues in the Philippines. Allow me to share some of my thoughts from the perspective of our institute. When the pandemic shocked the country last year, our team in our Stratbase intelligence group started to track what we call 8 pandemic challenges. And we argued that in this pandemic, and this was May of 2020, we started talking about this will be a long emergency. We need to resurrect our economy, but maybe we need to redirect it to a more investment-driven growth. And part of that, we saw an opportunity as we spoke to different multinational companies, as we spoke to countries that started looking at global supply chains. That maybe in a globalization in a post-pandemic future could be an opportunity for the Philippines to grow its trade and investment that will encourage job creation and improve the livelihood of the Filipino people. With this as background, allow me to just a quick review on the Philippine external trade performance. Latest data from the Philippine Statistics Authority shows that the country's total external trade grew by 16.9% year-on-year just last September 2021, but still lower than the previous month. But hopefully, as restrictions are eased, the trade deficit has also been widening, which means that countries' imports exceed exports can be addressed. So in my next slide, I'd like to focus on where the opportunities lie. You look at our external trade by economic bloc. We see APEC, we see the EU, we see the ASEAN, we see our East Asian neighbors. That's why we see it as a global opportunity. For the country, if it strengthens its ties with partners such as the European Union, where the trade gap is narrow, while registering a trade surplus during the first 9 months of 2021. This means that the Philippine export is competitive or are competitive enough to be able to gain a foothold in this area. And it reminds me of a study that I came across with conducted by the European Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines in partnership with the EU Delegation to the Philippines. Mid last year, that with the impact of COVID-19 on European businesses in the Philippines revealed that key recommendations from respondents. It's good to listen to the business sector. How do we promote seamless trade amid the COVID-19 crisis? And I took note of, we need to implement green lanes. We need to adopt international standards to ensure quality and safety of imported health-related products. We need to promote the free circulation of goods especially those of essential products, such as medicines, medical equipment, essentials, and perishable food products and livestock. But the fourth one I took note of is that we need to improve the facilitation of trade. And part of that is how can we make the Philippines competitive as an investment destination? Our institute have spoken on the need for investment-led growth. It's good to have the service sector. It's good to have consumer-driven economy. But imagine if we can create one that will make us an investment destination. It creates jobs, broadens the consumer base. And how do we do that? Again, the same study said we need to simplify the process of doing business in the Philippines. We need to fast-track infrastructure development. We need to clearly control the spread of COVID-19 in the country. And with the help of the private sector, the vaccination program is doing very well in urban areas. Hopefully, it spreads really around the country. But how can we make these recommendations happen? That is the challenge for us going into the 2021 election. Something that I wanted to share to participants of this session in partnership with the EU delegation in the Philippines is that we did a study, comprehensive study of what are the issues for the 2021 elections. And part of our questions is about the role of the private sector. 8 out of 10 Filipinos believe that the private sector should be engaged by government to invest in public infrastructures, such as roads, bridges, and airports, to save government funds for COVID-19 response. It's time to revisit the thinking of public-private partnership. I think the Philippine private sector is ready to partner with government. And maybe as we open up the economy more, we should encourage even foreign consortiums to look into public infrastructure in the country. There's a lot of role that we can find the private sector, both domestic and local. So we should take note of this. But to bounce back more quickly, the Philippines needs to recalibrate its growth trajectory by strengthening cooperation with its long-standing economic partners, including the European Union, through trade and investments. The Philippines, as a country, is presented with a favorable time to shift its trade patterns in order to address its widening trade deficit and recover from the economic downturn triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. While the Philippines' economic growth has been traditionally mostly consumption-led, this might be an opportune time to start shifting to a more investment-led economy, to focus on scaling up the country's role in the global supply chain. Forging regional and global partnership can not only bring significant economic and political returns for involved parties, but also help in addressing the widespread issues such as economic downturns, global warming, and the COVID-19 pandemic, and sustainable development. These are things that we can build from where we are today. Again, I would like to welcome everyone and allow me to introduce our keynote speaker, the Deputy Chief of the EU Delegation, Dr. Ana Sanchez. Dr. Ana, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much. Your Excellencies and members of the Diplomatic Corps, Mr. Tim Domanghit, President of the Strat-based ADR Institute, business and industry representatives, participants from the academy and civil society, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. It is my honor to represent the delegation of the European Union in today's session and to address the Pilipinas Conference for the first time. To begin, allow me to congratulate the Strat-based ADR Institute for this successful collaboration. Through your work, we we are all brought together virtually to discuss challenges common to all of us and to identify points of convergence where we could work together as we all rebound from this crisis. I hope that soon we will safely gather and have discussions face to face. Ostensibly, COVID-19 is an equalizer. The global economy has shrunk. Most economies have recorded heavy decline in their economic performance, including the EU and the Philippines. All of us have witnessed how a virus can cripple the global economy, hamper trade flows and investments, and freeze the movement of people. Almost 2 years since the onset of the pandemic, the global economy is poised to show its most robust post-recession recovery. Nevertheless, the rebound is expected to be uneven. This is already evident. Major economies are registering a strong growth, while many developing countries lag behind. The title of today's session, Philippine Trade Relations in the Pandemic Context, a part of EU-Philippine Trade and Sustainability Discussions 2021, is fitting. Indeed, an open multilateral trading system and the reinvigoration of traditional trade flows while ensuring sustainability are key pillars to rebound better. In the European Union, recovery is underway following a broad vaccination campaign and an ambitious recovery plan. Growth in the euro area outpaced both the US and China in the last quarter. Vaccination is the way to pull through collectively. More than 75% of adults in the EU are fully vaccinated. We have shared half of our vaccine production with the rest of the world and delivered more than 1 billion doses to more than 150 countries. Now, the EU's most urgent priority is to speed up global vaccination. The Philippines is among the top 10 beneficiaries of the COVAX facility, which aims to vaccinate 20 million Filipinos. The EU support to COVAX reflects our vision that no one is safe until everyone is safe. In addition to the widespread vaccination against COVID-19, the EU digital certificate is an important contribution to ensure free movement. Today, more than 400 million certificates have been generated across the EU, and 40 more countries, non-EU countries, are currently plugged in this open source, interoperable, and mutually recognized system, with 28 more countries in the pipeline. It is my hope that the Philippine government will also put in place a mutually recognized system to improve mobility of its citizens. Easier mobility, thanks to the digital certificate, will help businesses to operate safely and more efficiently. My ambassador, Ambassador Veron, has shared this vision in the many meetings that he has had with Philippine authorities. At the height of the pandemic, Europe chose to work together and to confront the challenges head-on. As the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said in her State of the Union address, in the biggest global health crisis for a century, Europe chose to do it together so that every part of Europe had the same access to a life-saving vaccine. In the deepest global economic crisis for decades, Europe chose to do it together with Next Generation EU. And in the gravest planetary crisis of all time, again, Europe chose to do it together with the European Green Deal, end of quote. Next Generation EU and the 7-year multi-annual budget of around 1,800 billion euro will invest in both short-term recovery and long-term prosperity. It will support innovative policies and will set Europe on a path of sustainable, resilient recovery. 1/3 of this 1,800 billion euro budget will finance the European Green Deal, which will be the EU's lifeline out of the COVID-19 crisis. This Green Deal will transform the EU into a modern, resource-efficient, and competitive economy. As a result, it is expected that 19 countries will revert to pre-pandemic levels in the coming, 19 EU countries will revert to pre-pandemic levels in the coming year. Of course, we recognize that there are clouds on the horizon. Clearly, the focus is now on tempering the spread of the virus and its impact on lives and economies. The EU has reflected on how this crisis has affected the shape of its economies, from increased debt to uneven impact on different sectors. There are also other challenges that linger, including protectionism and uncertainties around the multilateral trading system and the WTO reform, which may have a heavy toll on future growth. The Philippines is also trying to recover from the negative impact of COVID-19 on its economy and on Filipino livelihoods. The pandemic has resulted in substantial unemployment, increase of the cost of living, and poverty in urban and rural areas alike. Slowly, the Philippines is recovering. For the first 9 months of 2021, the Philippine economy has recorded an average of 5% GDP growth. Vaccination rollout has gained speed in the national capital region, its neighboring provinces, and main cities in the country. More and more businesses are opening up. Mobility for everyone, including children, has eased up. And face-to-face schooling, although on a pilot project manner, is being implemented and will hopefully soon be expanded. The sovereign reality phase now is an opportunity for the Philippines to adopt reforms and policies that will lead the country towards a resilient, sustainable recovery. Foreign investors and entrepreneurs, many of whom are virtually with us today, are eager to see substantial progress in economic reform, further opening to foreign capital and improvement in the business climate. The EU and the Philippines have established a relationship characterized by a shared goal of peace and prosperity for our peoples. Cooperation priorities of the EU with the Philippines under our new 2021-2027 financial program very much reflect EU's global priorities. 2 priority areas of cooperation have been agreed in close cooperation with the government. First, the green, resilient economy and green jobs, and secondly, peaceful and just society and good governance. In terms of commercial relations, we have seen a steady growth in the bilateral trade in goods between the EU and the Philippines over the last years, which reached in 2019, before the COVID outbreak, the level of 15 billion euros of total trade. However, EU-Philippines trade today is far from its full potential. In 2020, trade between the EU and the Philippines declined by 17%. While we must take into account the evident impact of COVID-19, let's not forget that EU-Vietnam trade is more than 3 times bigger than EU-Philippines trade. And EU-Thailand trade is 2.5 times bigger. Certainly, there is ample margin to do better. At present, the Philippines is enjoying the benefits of the EU GSP Plus trade preference, wherein more than 6,000 product lines enter the EU market at 0% tariff. The GSP Plus utilization rate of the Philippines in 2020 was around 75%. Agricultural and fishery products and manufactured goods highly benefit from GSP Plus. GSP Plus is an important competitive advantage for the Philippines, since the Philippines is the only ASEAN country that is granted this trade preference in the EU market. We look forward to continue a fruitful collaboration with the Philippines for the correct implementation of GSP for the years to come, especially in the respect of the human rights and labor rights conventions subscribed by the Philippines. For the European Union, the successful implementation of the GSP Plus, with its implications for human and labor rights, good governance, and environmental protection, is currently the first priority in the EU-Philippine trade relations. The EU is also an important source of foreign direct investments in the Philippines. Historically, the European Union contributed more than 25% of the total foreign direct investments to the Philippines. From an investment angle, the EU continues to see the Philippines as a large, fast-growing market. However, the Philippines does not succeed in mobilizing European traders and investors in line with its size and potential. For instance, on a yearly basis, the Philippines attracts, on average, only 4% of the total EU foreign direct investment in ASEAN countries. At bilateral level, the EU-Philippines Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, which entered into force in 2018, 18 is a crucial framework for political dialogue and cooperation. It also provides ground to strengthen further our economic and trade relations. I'm happy that in January 2021, in spite of COVID, we had the first virtual meeting of the newly established EU-Philippines Economic and Trade Subcommittee. While the focus of the Philippine government and Congress is to achieve sustainable recovery from this global crisis, we recognize that important policy reforms are ongoing in the Philippines, which, when fully implemented, will be beneficial to businesses and investors. In particular, we hope to see the full implementation of the customs modernization, the ease of doing business, and the CREATE Act. We also wish for the completion of the tax reform package and the passage of laws to liberalize foreign investments, amend the Public Services Act, and liberalize retail trade. We wish for the Philippines to get more European investors to enter the Philippine market, to create more quality jobs, and to contribute to the country's economic recovery. At the same time, the Philippines has the capacities and resources to maximize its access to the European market, as already successfully done by the likes of Jollibee and ICTSI. So let us continue working so that in the next years, we will all be able to recover from this crisis and our peoples will take full advantage of more sustainable and inclusive economies. If the EU dedicates so much effort to build back better in Europe, it does so with a great sense of collective responsibility and a clear intent to lead by example. We cannot repeat enough that we heal together and we recover together. With all the changes going on around us, let us exert efforts to create a level playing field and opportunities for industries and sectors for more players to be able to participate, to provide more choices to consumers, and to promote a sustainable approach to trade. Thank you again for this invitation and for your attention, and I wish everyone a fruitful discussion ahead.
Thank you, Sir Ana Isabel Sanchez-Ruiz, the Deputy Head of the EU Delegation, but also the Head of its Political, Press, and Information Section. Thank you for a very insightful, substantive keynote address. Allow me to introduce our moderator for this session of Pilipinas Conference 2021. He is an active partner of Strat-based ADR Institute, especially in our advocacy on trade, investment, and economic reforms. Our moderator this morning is Attorney Anthony Abad, an international trade lawyer. So, Tony, can I pass on the session to you?
Certainly. Thank you, Boss Dindo. Thank you for having me here again. Always happy to be with my friends at Strat-based ADRI. A business-friendly policy environment should be in place in order to enable trade to flourish and to allow the entry of more investments into the country. Let me add that what we also want to achieve is an economy that is inclusive and one that will address all the problems that have been highlighted by this recent and existing pandemic issue. This panel will tackle the necessary initiatives that the Philippines policymakers should push and act upon to boost trade and investments, which can help the economy recover faster. And with this, let me now introduce the members of the first panel to talk about rebuilding lives through employment generation. We have my a very familiar face, somebody that I've known wearing many hats. Today, he's wearing the hat of the Employers Confederation of the Philippines. None other than Mr. Sergio Ortiz Luis, the President of the Employers Confederation of the Philippines, Honorary Chairman and Treasurer of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Mr. Ortiz Luis serves as President and CEO of PhilExport and is the founding director of the International Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sergio Ortiz Luis Jr. Boss.
Good morning. President of Strat-Based ADR Institute Professor Victor Andres Dean Dumanhit and other board members. Trade Secretary Ramon M. Lopez, Deputy Head of the European Delegation to the Philippines, Dr. Ana Isabel Sanchez Ruiz, Chairman of the Philippine Exporters Confederation, Dr. George Barcelon, Treasurer of the Makati Business Club, Ms. Rizalina Mantaring, President of the Philippine Institute of Development Studies, Dr. Aniceto Orbeta, President of the European Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, Mrs. Lars Withig, Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council, Mr. Chris Humphrey, CEO of the Trade Advisor, Attorney Anthony Abad, participants, guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to join this gathering and discussion among esteemed personalities, whom I notice have also been at the front lines of the advocacy prescribing ways towards recovery complemented by structural reform. Walang iwanan. I heard this being quoted in the last 2 years over and over again by many people, government, businessmen, and ordinary citizens alike. We see signals that the right intentions may be there, but the manner of execution varies. As a result, marami ding naiiwanan. And this includes 3.88 million people with no work as of September. This is equivalent to an unemployment rate of 8.1%, the highest for 2021, and could have also been viewed as the highest since the 10% recorded in July 2020 so far. On the other hand, a total of 43.59 million Filipinos had worked in September, bringing the employment rate to 91.1%, lower than August 91.9% or 44.23 million. However, the underemployment rate, or the percentage of the working population looking for more work, went down to 14.2% or 6.18 million Filipinos in September from 14.7% or 6.48 million Filipinos in August 1st. Anticipating the worst, the Employers' Confederation of the Philippines, or ECOP, initiated programs and projects even at the start of this pandemic to help mitigate the negative impact of this crisis, especially on business and workers. I wish to start this quick list with the latest of these collaboration efforts, which is the National Employment Recovery Strategy, or NERS, task force that signed the Reform, Rebound, Recover 1 million jobs for 2021. The 1 million job aims to immediately source Filipino talents for deployment in the construction, manufacturing, particularly semiconductor and electronics, tourism, and hospitality and export industries under a policy environment that would help create jobs all over the country. Earlier, a joint resolution on COVID-19 response and economic recovery was formalized by ECOP with a number of business organizations and labor groups. Under this resolution, business and labor groups reiterate their readiness to participate proactively in policy making, believing that our health and economic frontliners deserve a better solution, one that would not sacrifice the workers and their families in a framework that is grounded on science and urgent social needs. Covered by these resolutions are important urgent interventions which are directed to the government for appropriate action, namely: 1. Immediately address the demand of our healthcare workers for protection and mandated special risk allowance and other benefits, and hire additional home care workers as provided under the Bayanihan Law and as demanded by the prevailing emergency situation. 2. Step up the vaccination program. 3. Enhance capacity for free testing and treatment by increasing the budget and personnel for this program. 4. Mandate use of single technology-based contact tracing application for easier consolidation of data. We are also pushing for a waiver of Data Privacy Act for this purpose alone, for efficiency and cost saving. 5. Rapidly expand capacities for isolation and treatment by setting up more medical-grade facilities with ample support for healthcare workers. 6. Ensure that all those who would be hospitalized are fully covered by PhilHealth, and for the latter to immediately resolve outstanding issues with private hospitals. 7. Provide guaranteed income based on cost of living and other factors for all workers who need to be quarantined. 8. Allow full operation of public transport and step up the use of service contracting, including salaried transport workers, by infusing more funds and by working with local government units, transport cooperatives, and corporations to ensure enforcement of health protocols in all means of public transport. 9. Provide funds for LGUs to enable them to extend ayuda to all those affected by lockdowns. 10. Certify as urgent Bayanihan 3 and legislate the same the soonest possible time, and continuously address corruption issues. We have likewise attempted to postpone the proposed increases in premium contribution to and penalty condonation by the SSS, PhilHealth, and Pag-ibig. So far, we are grateful to Pag-ibig for its prompt and positive response as its contribution to the process of further reopening and rebuilding the economy. Further, we are continuously working with the Department of Labor and Employment and TESDA in upgrading skills, particularly to meet the demands of this digital transformation that is evolving globally. Hit the most by this pandemic, we are handholding the micro, small and medium enterprises to pivot to sectors and platforms that are successfully exhibiting resilience and increasing demand. Towards this, we are partners with other business support organizations such as the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and PhilExport in promoting innovation and technology as a productivity, competitiveness, and business continuity response. These action points were arrived at considering that in this pandemic, workers both in the health and economic front lines, face the highest risk of getting infected and losing their jobs either temporarily or permanently. Meanwhile, businesses, especially the 99.96% micro, small, and medium enterprises, continue to suffer as mobility of people and transport of goods are disrupted by protocols and restrictions. The employment statistics only tell the magnitude of the business and the job crisis, but the enterprise and household levels, the conditions can be far worse. As I conclude, let me quote a fellow from the Stanford University who once said, "The real minimum wage is zero unemployment. To achieve this, one economist radically suggests government to create jobs and guarantee to send people to jail and send people to jail if they don't work." But would it be desirable? The same economist does not agree, explaining that some unemployment is good because it allows people or workers to be matched with employers with which they are most productive. As long as market conditions are constantly changing, it makes sense that people would change jobs. But since this is not an instant process, some underemployment comes necessary. What we want to avoid is long-term unemployment, which is essentially a market failure and devastating to individuals whom it afflicts. The declining positive COVID-19 cases are giving us tremendous hope that the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel is within reach, even as we recognize that the road to full recovery is still marred by unfolding political drama and scandals, disruptions in supply chain, continuing health and environment concerns, high cost and unstable supply of power and connectivity, among others. But as in past crises, we do not freeze. We look for ways forward, battered by so many calamities in various forms. This walang susuko mentality has been ingrained in Filipinos' DNA, and this is where we are again. Surely, the reason why we are gathered today, walang susuko, walang iwanan. Thank you, stay safe, and good day to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Boss June. Um, the next member of the panel is going to be talking about boosting Philippine exports for long-term growth. And another friend and a gentleman who wears many hats. And this time, I get confused. Sometimes you're the president of PCCI. Today, you are chairperson for Philippine Exporters Confederation, Inc., or PhilExport. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. George Barcelon chairs the PhilExport, which is the umbrella organization for Philippine exporters, committed to the work of continuing development of the Philippines and prosperity of Filipinos through exports. Former president of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, but I'm sure still very active, and I think will give us some very important insights into this very key measure for building capital, eradicating poverty, and putting the Philippines back on track. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. George Barcelon.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Nice seeing you again, Attorney Abad. President of Stratbase ADR, Institute Professor, a good friend, Victor Andres Dindo Manhit, to the board members, Trade Secretary Ramon M. Lopez, Deputy Head of the European Delegation to the Philippines, Dr. Ana Isabel Sanchez Ruiz, President of Employers Confederation of the Philippines and colleague in other organizations, Dr. Sergio Ortiz Ruiz Jr., Treasurer of Makati Business Club, Ms. Rizalina Matarang, President of the Philippine Institute of Development Studies, Dr. Aniceto Orbeta Jr., President of the European Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, Mr. Lars Wittig, Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council, Mr. Chris Humphrey, and of course, our moderator, Attorney Anthony Abad. To the participants, guests from the Diplomatic Corps, from the academies, friends, ladies and gentlemen, magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Upfront, I'd like to start with the positive news. We haven't been hearing too much positive except for the COVID-19. So this is a good positive news. That the Philippine export industry is resilient, recovering, and open for business as we continue to evolve as a reliable, competitive global supplier in this new normal. We are able to move on from surviving to thriving. Survey shows that the pandemic has severely impacted many of the micro, small, and medium exporters. But it's heartening to see the gradual improvement in our export performance. At present, Philippine exports have risen from a 50% plunge in April 2020 to an 18% year-on-year increase up to September of this year. This marks the 7th consecutive month of improved performance, which is expected to further grow as the world economies open up. Electronic will continue to account for the biggest dollar earner, accounting for 57% of the total. In fact, the Semiconductor and Electronic Industry of the Philippines Foundation has hiked its growth forecast for the country's electronic export this year to 10% amid strong demand in industrial, medical, automotive, and telecom electronic products as the growth drivers. Other export performance during this period are services, mineral products, agri-produce, and other manufacturing goods. Our major trading partner for exports is the United States, which comprised the highest amount in 2020 of almost $20 billion, or a share about 17.5%. And comes second is the European Community, which is for 2020 about €7 billion. And we in the Philippines have taken advantage of the GSP Plus and the utilization of about 71% with the GSP Plus. Completing the top 5 major export trading partners in value and percent shares are the People's Republic of China, Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. The government has lowered the alert levels towards the full reopening of the economy, coupled with the fast-tracking of vaccination program, which are critical interventions to help achieve our recovery and growth targets. The need to continue our competitive stance in pushing and promoting more export activities under this pandemic situation. The government realized the importance of export. So mobility and safety protocols were crafted to allow the sector to continue operations with the least disruption possible. In response, exporters worked to closely monitor relevant global developments, pivoted to other products, markets, and processes when possible, but put in place the necessary protocols, trained our workers for higher skills, and adopted appropriate technologies, leveraging on e-commerce. Obviously, the challenges in this journey are many. Enterprises and sectors are coming in from various development levels and needs. Our resources are finite, and there is urgency to do many things at the same time. What has hit the exporters by surprise in the last 6 months has been the global logistic crisis, which saw freight rates surge up to 500% compared to pre-pandemic level. This has led to some MSMEs to temporarily stop their operations. Philippine Exporters Confederation, even under such challenging times, continue delivering our regular programs and frontline services, such as providing modest funds to qualified projects. Secretariat of our chapters and sectors association continue to assist our members. We are also implementing a new program called PhilExport 30 and Future Ready, or P30 for short. Launched last September, P30 is part of the action plan in our recovery roadmap. Using two strategies, technology and closer collaboration with partners, it features 5 components, namely AI-powered PhilExport portal, business continuity plan, the road to the 4th Industrial Revolution Empowerment Project, thematic clusters, and Export Connect, all of which involve PhilExport and our members as both beneficiaries and users. Complementing this, our work with the executive and legislative branches of government that involve outstanding issues such as streamlining of documents, the ease of doing business through the computerization of the system. Others such as rationalizing government fees, capacity building, and skills upgrading towards the 4th Industrial Revolution. And we coordinate with the government, DTI, for the funding of the MSMEs to fund their export promotions, R&D, technology acquisition. It is still important for the country to focus on infrastructure such as power, telecommunication, farm-to-market road, logistics issue for us to enhance our exports to the world market. Groundwork regarding the Philippine Export Development Plan for the next 6 years has started. Part of the inputs will be sector prioritization and capacity building, helped by projects such as with the European Union's ARISE, USAID's Deliver, and Korea's KTNet. Incidentally, PhilExport is part of the organizing team with the DTI Export Marketing Bureau and the Export Development Council, which are behind the annual National Exporters Week and National Export Congress to be celebrated from December 1 to 7 of this year. The theme is ARISE, A-R-I-S-E, which stands for Accelerate, Rebuilding, Innovations, Support, and Empowerment of the Philippine Exports, which emphasize the need to fast-track the export industry recovery to accelerate economic rebuilding, innovate through digital transformation and technologies upgrade, and the empowerment of exporters towards long-term global competitiveness. In closing, we are fortunate to have been working with the right government and private sector's partners to make a difference in helping contribute to the recovery, resilience, and eventually rebounding to where we were pre-pandemic. Weathering this pandemic will require focus and strong public and private partnership to maximize the limited resources. It will be long and a arduous climb, but we hope to come out of this crisis stronger and much better as an industry, as the people, and as a nation. Maraming salamat po. At saka mabuhay tayong lahat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Boss George. And now we move on to our next panelist, who happens to be a colleague of mine and of Boss Dindo at the Foundation for Economic Freedom, Ms. Rizalina Mantaring. Is going to talk about putting the Philippines on the map and the role of the private sector. Riza is a treasurer of the Makati Business Club, board member of the Philippine Business for Education. She's also the chair of the Committee on National Issues of the Management Association of the Philippines, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Makati Business Club as well. She is a board member of the PBED and a former CEO of Sun Life Financial Philippines, after which she assumed the chairmanship of Sun Life Financial Philippines holding company until recently stepping down. But Riza does not look like a retiree at all, no? And still quite active in all our economic advocacy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Riza Mantaring.
Morning, thank you, Tony, and morning to all our esteemed guests, our speakers, and our listeners. I will be sharing a presentation. Okay, I hope you can see it. Okay, yes. So this morning I'll be talking a little bit about trade and investments and putting the Philippines on the trade and investments map and the private sector role. So here you can see the trade partnerships that the Philippines has. There are quite a number actually all over the world. With the EU, we have of course GSP Plus, as was mentioned earlier, and the free trade agreement with the European Free Trade Area. As a member of ASEAN, we also participate in agreements of ASEAN with countries like India, China, New Zealand, and we also have bilateral agreements with Korea and Japan. Of course, we know we participate in the WTO and RCEP, although that hasn't been ratified. Now, in 2020, despite all of these, as we can see, not surprisingly, exports and imports declined with all the mobility restrictions and the disruptions to the supply chain. This year, as of the first half, we've already reached pre-pandemic levels in terms of goods exports, and we expect to reach 14% and 20% in exports and imports increase by the end of the year. And as George said earlier, we're actually up 18% already in exports as of September. But our trade volume remains far below the rest of the ASEAN 6, and our outlook continues to remain tentative because of uncertainty over the pace of the global and domestic recovery because of the pandemic. We're already seeing resurgences everywhere. Okay? The pandemic exposed the fragility of the Philippine supply chains. Now, what are the barriers to participation in global trade? The World Economic Forum classifies these barriers into 4 general categories: market access, which have to do with things like quotas and domestic content requirements; border administration, which would be both the efficiency and the transparency of border controls and export-import procedures; our telecom transport infrastructure and transport infrastructure, which would be the availability and the quality of the services; and the business environment, the regulations, the physical security, and the governance. So I'm sure you're already starting to see what are some of the barriers that the Philippines has and some of the issues that we face on why our trade remains below the rest of the ASEAN 6, and in fact a lot of below comparable sized countries. An adequate physical and digital infrastructure. This has been spoken of. Our road network ranks below, again, the rest of the ASEAN 6. And our digital infrastructure, we've heard a lot about how our internet is the slowest and the most costly in Asia, at least in ASEAN. Then red tape. Okay, the amount of red tape we face, it still takes among the highest number of procedures to open a new business here. And dealing with the government is often not easy because of all the requirements. And then regulatory uncertainties. As I often say, money is the most cowardly of things. It will flee at the first sign of trouble. And if you're investing $1 billion, $2 billion or more in the country, you want to be sure that 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, the rules don't suddenly change. You want certainty. And then in terms of application of laws by the LGUs, they're interpreted differently. And in addition to that, there are even local regulations that are someone put in place. Then the lack of supplier industries. We have locators in our export processing zones, for example, but many of them are forced to import almost all their components because they don't have those supplier industries. And if we want to attract people to locate here, we need to develop that whole network of supplier industries. And often a lot of those are MSMEs, as George pointed out earlier. And then corruption. I think I need not say more about this, but just a few years ago, I was speaking with some companies, foreign companies that were planning to set up here, and they had already located people on the ground. But 2, 3 years later, they were gone because they just couldn't deal with the corruption that they were forced to deal with. In all indices measuring supply chain performance, the Philippines ranks near the bottom of APEC countries. Of course, the good news is we have a lot of room for improvement and we can improve. So all of this, of course, results in low competitiveness, which is why our trade volume remains below the rest of the ASEAN 6, like I mentioned earlier. Singapore, in fact, has over 4 times our trade volume, and even Indonesia has, the rest of them actually have trade volumes that are quite a bit higher than ours. So how do we increase trade and invite more foreign investment? You've heard us say over and over again, open up the economy. These are laws that they really need to be signed into laws. The Public Services Act, the Foreign Investment Act, the Retail Trade Liberalization Act. The pandemic has decimated a lot of our industries. We need all the investment we can attract, both local and foreign. So we need to open up the economy because we have the third most restrictive economy in the world. We need to improve our infrastructure, both physical and digital. The pandemic exposed the difficulties we encounter because of the inadequate infrastructure we have, from the port congestion, difficulty in transporting goods, and then digital. The pandemic really showed the inequalities that exist around the country, with many having not only poor internet access, but no internet access at all for long periods of time when they have to go on online learning, when they have to try to work from home. We need to pursue win-win labor market reforms. This is one of the most difficult markets when it comes to labor regulations. And I've often been asked, why can't you fire someone who is non-performing? Why do we have to prove so many things before we can fire them? And we also have to protect labor. But why not win-win reforms? Like, for example, instead of security of tenure, why not have portability of pensions? Many people, when they move from company to company, lose all the retirement benefits they've accumulated. But if you allow them to bring those accumulated funds from company to company, then they would have a nest egg by the time they retire. We need to provide better incentives and support, particularly for manufacturing and MSMEs. We found that MSMEs, which are part of a business support organization, were far more resilient, for example, in this pandemic. We need to reduce red tape. I don't need to say much more about that. And we need to invest in human capital. We saw a lot of new services, new industries coming up as people were forced to adapt in the pandemic. But many of them are digital, they're online, and they require skills that our existing labor force may perhaps not have. So we need to invest in upskilling them, particularly in technology and in skills required in the new industrial revolution. And of course, we need to enhance governance. Now, the private sector can be a great partner and has been a great partner in addressing all these issues, as we've seen in the success of the PPP projects in building roads, bridges, airports. The private sector has access to capital and probably better access to technology and talent. It's more efficient and can move more quickly because we're not hampered by all the regulations and the laws that restrict government agencies. There's more incentive to produce quality because we have to compete, and not just domestically, but globally. And having to compete globally means we need to meet global standards. We need to align with those standards, which you can bring into the country, and again, build linkages to the global economy. The private sector is also the primary source of innovation anywhere in the world. And that's because, public and private sector really have different roles. Even in the US, SpaceX is actually a PPP initiative if you think about it, because it was, um, yes, SpaceX is private, but NASA supported it. So the private sector can really be and has always been a great partner in nation building, and it can do even more given the right environment. We have seen a lot of innovation happen because we were forced to change things. The pandemic forced a lot of changes. New products and services came up. We saw a massive increase in e commerce, and we saw the shift to electronic cash. Early in the pandemic, as mobility was restricted, we saw a lot of people start selling in our communities. But I had to keep withdrawing cash because they wanted to be paid in cash. Now, my last withdrawal has been sitting in my drawer for months because nobody asks for cash anymore. Everything is GCash, Paymaya, um, bank transfers. And GCash, in fact, last year had 1 trillion worth of transactions being paid through GCash. This year, I think their expectation is it will be 3 trillion. And pleasantly, we saw improved logistics. If you order from Lazada or Shopee now, you get your item in 2 days, 3 days, something unheard of in the past. And even if something comes from China, okay, or from somewhere else, you find that you get it in days. Of course, not with the latest problem with logistics globally, but yes, it was only taking days. And even with the problems, we still continue to get it faster than we used to. It was not business as usual because we had no choice. We couldn't conduct business the way we used to. But not business as usual also applied to other things. We came to a realization of certain things, and I would just like to leave you with some food for thought. In the 20th century, the mantra was really maximize shareholder value. But in the 21st century, it's maximize value for society. Now, some skeptics among you will probably say, do you actually expect business not to put profit above all else? And I would propose that yes, business will be forced to do that because the next generation is different. The next study after study shows that the next generation want purpose. They want to buy products from companies that they see behave ethically and that they trust. They want to make investments that make money but also make a measurable positive impact. And we've seen this in the rise of in the value of shares on companies that do espouse ESG. Now, even companies or corporations are already taking this into account. I was speaking recently with a multinational fund manager that has operations in the Philippines, and they said they have already incorporated ESG into their criteria on where to place their funds. We are also seeing pressure on businesses coming from the civil society, from people, to really help in addressing society's greatest challenges, such as poverty, environmental degradation. I think more and more we'll see that our clients, our customers, our governments have to see that we're balancing the interests of all stakeholders. Governments and companies are really taking action to enforce ESG principles. My husband used to work for a electronics manufacturing services firm, and one of their clients is one of the largest electronics firms in the world. And they actually sent people here to the Philippines to review their processes and to really inspect their premises, to check what their labor practices were, what their other practices were. And they had a bit of difficulty understanding why people were working up to 12 hours, not realizing that people wanted the overtime pay. So you encounter things like those. And just last week, the EU representative announced that they were pushing for a law that would ban importation of products that contribute to deforestation. So I think we're going to see more and more as we move forward that if we want to be a greater participant in the global supply chain, if we want to increase our trade volumes, if we want to attract more foreign direct investments, we will have to embrace ESG principles and incorporate them in our practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Riza. And I hope you'll allow me to borrow your presentation. It's a very good advocacy piece. I think you hit all the nails on the head, especially the most important of all, of course, is capital accumulation through a more open and integrated, which, well, sadly, we really have fallen quite far behind. But let's move on, perhaps with a certain measure of hope. No? Last not the least, another member of this panel will be talking about, from a technical point of view, no? Employment generation through globalization. And from a very respected institution, which is one that I've worked with before, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. And we have with us today the president of PIDS, Dr. Aniceto Orbeta Jr. PIDS is considered as one of the country's pioneers in impact evaluation research and specializes in applied economic modeling, social sector issues, demographic, economics, and information technologies. Through PIDS, modeling and its analytical tools, we can then verify and confirm empirically that globalization and openness actually lead to employment generation. So without further ado, Dr. Orbeta, welcome.
Pleasant day, co-presenters. A pleasant day, everyone. My apologies that I cannot join you live today because of a scheduled engagement. I hope this recording will do justice to the request. The organizers have asked me to provide a perspective on globalization and employment. This presentation was prepared with the assistance of PIDS trade specialist Dr. Francis Kimba and Ramonit Serafika. I grouped my presentation into two themes. First, the relationship between globalization and employment. The second is its implication for the Philippines. The relationship between globalization and employment starts from the basic economic principle that employment is a derived demand of economic activity. Thus, given technology, more economic activity also means more employment. Talking of the globalization that we know, when we are asked to think of globalization, what we have in mind are goods and services moving across borders. That is why when we think about movements of goods, we think of containers. Another important component of globalization that we know is movements of factors of production, such as labor, capital, and technology. Movement of capital that are visible is foreign direct investments because they translate into production units within our borders. The not so visible movements or capital flows into our stock markets. The other movement of factors that do not need elaboration for most of us is labor migration. This is because if you don't have an immediate family member working abroad, chances are we have relations, classmates, and friends working there. Before the pandemic, we have been deploying over 2 million a year. The remittances that they send contribute more than 33 billion in 2029 and 2020, or almost 10% of our GDP. This is the globalization that we know. Let me now turn to the newer form of globalization that have emerged. This part we are still trying to understand. Given the speed of technology change, famous trade economist Robert Baldwin says this is perhaps unknowable, but certainly inevitable. Unknowable because it is in the future, and technologies tend to morph into something else before we can completely understand it. There are two new forms of globalization emerging. The first form is robots employed in production of goods and services, or globotics. Baldwin also calls it artificial intelligence. Generally, it is not jobs that are automated but tasks and processes. That's why it is more precisely called robotic process automation, or RPA. Very common applications are faceless robotic arms or delivery robots that pick up and deliver specific parts at precise times, quantities, and locations in an assembly line. Advanced RPAs have avatars or even appear as a humanoid such as Sophia. Some may not have imposing appearances but have endearing names like Siri or Alexa. So today when you complain about a piece of equipment you bought, there's a good chance that you might be talking to a computer program. Traditional firms employing people will have to compete with firms that are employing RPAs. The very common question nowadays causing people anxiety is, are robots taking away our jobs? RPAs have several advantages over humans. Besides precision, they don't tire, so they don't need rest or sleep. And the pandemic highlighted still another feature: they don't get sick. This kind of analysis, however, considers only one impact of technology, that is, it substitutes for labor. There are two other effects, namely, it complements labor and it creates jobs. Thus, conceptually, the net effect depends on which of the three is strongest. The second form emerging and becoming visible here now is telemigration. Baldwin called this remote intelligence. These are people working for production units in another country but sitting in homes or offices within their borders. The case of telemigration is easier to illustrate now than before the pandemic. If you have experience working at home, then you have done a form of telemigration. You can use that experience as a prototype. Doing office tasks away from your usual office is telemigration. The technology behind platforms such as Upwork, Amazon Mechanical Turk, and Fiverr facilitates the matching of skills, demand, and supply. What encourages this is the difference in wages. As in trade in physical sense, telemigration happens because it's much cheaper to hire a graphic designer, computer programmer, virtual assistant, or encoder in Manila than in London. Sure, there will maybe difference in quality of service, but the difference in wage is usually much more, and a little training can erase the quality difference. Let me now turn to the implications of these developments for the country. When I wrote a paper to empirically test the relationship between globalization and employment almost 20 years ago, it focused on goods trade, exports and imports, and trade intensity. The paper concluded that increase in propensity to export shifts demand for labor upward. In terms of employment structure, propensity to export is a boon to women workers and low-skilled production workers. It validated accepted theory then. That is now old-school analysis. What about the impact of these new developments? There are analyses in other countries, but I'm not aware of rigorous empirical analysis yet using our own data. As mentioned earlier, the net effect of technology depends on which of the three effects is strongest. It's also clear that innovations in digital technology and the internet will profoundly affect the manufacturing and movements of goods and services, including capital and people. Recognizing the potential of the fourth industrial revolution or FIRE technologies to manufacturing and trade, Philippine companies have begun shifting to FIRE technologies and products, but the shift is not as fast and is selective. A recent DTI survey of manufacturing firms presented by DTI Undersecretary Rafael Aldaba shows that only 5% have employed FIRE technologies, as shown in the graph. Another noticeable feature that mostly large companies with global markets do it. I included the company logos of those who are documented to have done so, but we don't have time to discuss what each have done so far. Now, it is worth emphasizing that in the era of robotics, we'll be focused on the service sector with automation driven by information and data. So let me turn to digital services trade and online work. Digitally deliverable services comprise various services that could be supplied digitally, including insurance and pension services, financial services, charges for the use of intellectual property, telecommunications, computer and information services, other business services, and audiovisual and related services. It is based on the concept of ICT-enabled services. In a recent paper by colleagues at PIDS, it has pointed out that UNCTAD estimates put digitally deliverable services at half of the services exports. For the Philippines, it turns out to be even higher than the world average, but unfortunately appears to be declining while in others this is rising. This is shown in the leftmost figure. What about telemigration or online work? I characterize this using real-time data scraped by researchers at the iLabor project at the Oxford Internet Institute from online labor market platforms. The online labor index they created indicates that online work continues to grow. During the pandemic, it shows that there was a dip, particularly for creative and multimedia and sales and marketing support, but some tasks like software development and technology are largely unaffected. Another insight from the data is that a considerable proportion of online workers in the Philippines are in jobs that have low value added. Around 25% of workers in the Philippines are into clerical and data entry services, colored gray in the middle graph. While such workers account for less than 10% in Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, and Pakistan. On the other hand, we continue to have high concentration of created multimedia, colored red in the middle graph, which perhaps shows our competitive advantage. Meanwhile, only 14% of the Filipino online workers are doing software development and technology tasks, colored blue in the middle graph, which is clearly low compared to the proportion of such workers in India, Pakistan, and even Vietnam at 59, 45, and 52% respectively. Vietnam in particular has shifted toward a higher end software and development technology as shown in the rightmost graph. Let me conclude with the recommendations for the Philippines given these developments. In terms of trade of goods and services, we obviously need to prepare for what Baldwin called the inevitable by encouraging manufacturing sector to employ fire technologies. It's noted in the presentation of DTI's Yusik Aldaba that most of the Philippine industries are still transitioning from Industry 2.0 to 3.0, while some larger firms are linked to the global markets are taking steps towards digitalization and smart manufacturing. We recognize that the Philippines is an industrial latecomer, but recent pre-pandemic growth laid the foundation for manufacturing resurgence. In addition, we recognize that the Philippines relies on foreign companies in key technological sectors. Because of this, there is a need for the Philippines not just to attract foreign businesses to increase the scale of high-tech firms in the country, but also to increase the avenues for knowledge transfer. Furthermore, as companies begin to embrace technology, they need to take note of low-skilled, low-educated, and routinized jobs, which would be the most vulnerable to adverse effects of technological change. Thus, initiatives related to upskilling and retooling need to be in place. Fundamental reform is to remove the Philippine FDI restrictions, which are mostly in services sectors, telecommunications, transport, mass media, advertising, education. This reform will enable foreign firms to enter the Philippine market or expand it already existing and increase the access and improve the quality of services available to Filipinos. More importantly, this will also help the export sector in goods and services, digital or non-digital, to be more competitive. Investing in digital infrastructure would support access to digital connectivity as the Philippines adjust to the digitalization. Unnecessary restrictive labor market regulations may hinder flexibility and agility to adapt to changing production and delivery systems rapidly. Finally, in the case of online work, we need to build an ecosystems for skills and talent development. This should include hard skills such as ICT skills, numeracy and literacy, and soft skills such as willingness to learn, adaptability, diligence, grit, and a positive attitude to work. The rapid change in technology calls for continuous learning. New forms of work engagement such as online work are often not covered by existing social protection systems. Hence, the need for the strengthening of and expanding of social protection system coverage. The visibility of platform work in our statistical reports will provide accurate and updated information that will guide policy better. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Very much, Dr. Beta. And I think PIDS studies give us some empirical evidence that that openness and integration into the global economy is really our way out, and our way into a more inclusive and dynamic economy post-pandemic. And now this takes us to the second part of the conference program for this morning. We are mindful of the time. We're a little behind, so we will have to move a little faster. It may affect also the time that we allotted for our open forum. Our second part focuses now on our partnership with the European Union. And we want to take a look at the EU point of view. What does Europe see when it looks at the Philippines? What is its outlook on trade and investments with the Philippines? And how do we take this partnership further? In addressing a crisis as massive as the COVID-19 pandemic and the recession it brought to us, it's important for stakeholders to forge partnerships and cooperate to achieve this common goal of development. Indeed, the Philippines should consider strengthening its ties with trade partners such as the EU, rather than continuing on in isolation from the rest of the world. This second panel, will focus on the perspectives of stakeholders from the EU, from the European Union, on the imperative steps to achieve this shared prosperity. First on this panel, again, a good friend with the Philippines, to talk about achieving inclusive recovery through economic cooperation. We have the President, the European Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, the oldest European chamber outside of Europe, Mr. Lars Wittig. The ECCP provides support by facilitating market access and working on the creation of a level playing field for both European and Filipino companies. I think it looks towards more trade and more competition and cooperation between the Philippines and Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Lars Wittig. Lars.
Well, it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without somebody being on mute. I just did that. Thank you very much, Tony. And I will just share my screen. Yep, here we go. And I'll never get used to this, but who can get used to the pandemic either? Bear with me. I promise otherwise to speed it up so that we don't take time away from the Q&As, which is always the most interesting and dynamic part. But yeah, you already introduced ECCP quite well, being the oldest European chamber outside of Europe. Here in the Philippines, we have 700 plus member companies, and in our staff, we have over 30 full-time employees. We have many membership committees, each one dedicated to single industries. And of course, they then seek leverage across multiple countries, but obviously within the same industries. This basically makes us from a European point of view, the #1 industry or business organization for advocacy and shared leverage in pursuing business opportunities between Europe and the Philippines. Our services are quite broad, actually, to the members. And even beyond, I would say, we have also many Filipino member companies. And besides organizing for trade delegations from Europe coming to the Philippines, we actually also help export from the Philippines, helping into trade fairs in Europe. We do a lot of advocacy. We are the #1 representative among private businesses and touch point for the government here in the Philippines when they want to consult or want to hear our point of views relative to regulations and new laws, and even actually the considerations about amending the Constitution. So, and we're also part of the Joint Foreign Chambers, so where again, with barely a dozen profiles, we represent together Canada, US, Japan, Korea, and Australia, New Zealand, plus the two of us, Florian, the Executive Director, and myself, representing all of Europe. By the way, not just EU, this is all of Europe, which also will be reflected in the issues that I will be addressing. First of all, I mean, the economy is picking up again, in the sense that we have positive and not negative numbers. Clearly, there is what is referred to as the low base, meaning we are coming from something very negative last year, but nevertheless, we are seeing a recovery, and it is felt. It is felt in trade, in investments, which I will elaborate a little bit further on, but it is actually also felt in the consumer offtake, etc., among our member companies. Just going to level 2 in Metro Manila, it does have a high, very positive psychological impact on consumers. Looking at the Philippine rankings, it is always important to look at the so-called VIP countries when we compare ourselves. VIP is Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, because those are the ones that we are mostly competing with when it comes to investments and trade. If one country is going to be prioritized over another by single investors. And actually, we are very much, I would say, at level with the Indonesia and Vietnam when it comes to ease of doing business. We are all quite high, but Philippines is actually showing by far the greatest improvement, and I think that is a very important trend to see here, because we have had some major improvements over the last 12 to 18 months, actually within the last year, in regards to the operating environment, despite of COVID-19, which is regional anyway. So the Philippine rankings here, again, they are all high. Foreign direct investments, the Philippines lacks in terms of attractiveness. But I think what we have learned during the COVID-19 is that the investments that are into the Philippines are much more resilient in the Philippines than the comparable countries in the region. Last year, FDIs dropped with 24% into the Philippines. By the way, only 12% if we focus on the European investors, whereas it dropped dramatically more into other ASEAN countries. We always were much lower. We received much lower FDIs than, say, Thailand or Malaysia. Actually, I remember there was 1 month, 3 or 4 years ago, it was the month of May, where we had higher FDIs into the Philippines than Thailand. That was the first time I experienced that since I moved here in 1992. But actually, last year, 2020, FDIs into the Philippines were higher for the total year than Thailand and Malaysia combined. So that is interesting. It was very resilient on behalf of, I can say, on behalf of the European investments. The Japanese, they almost doubled. The American investments, they dropped like average 24%, and Chinese investors basically ceased to exist. The Philippine rankings, foreign direct investments is definitely uptick in FDIs is foreseen following enactment of the Corporate Recovery and Tax Incentive for Enterprises Act, CREATE. I'm sure many of the speakers here has been and will be referring to CREATE, but these new acts are really strongly improving the operating environment for foreign investors, and it helps me and ECCP to promote the Philippines, because actually, even though I, in my day job, I'm responsible for all of ASEAN, Philippines is where I'm based. This is where I will stay. I'm a permanent resident, and this really helps all of us to market the Philippines over and above any other market country within ASEAN in the region. And the amendments to the Foreign Investment Act and the Retail Trade Liberalization Act also showed much improvement with what has been approved thus far. Not as much as some had hoped for, but it took us a very long time to get the improvements that we saw this year. The current business environment, obviously we have to talk COVID here, but anyway, a mobility rate of vaccine administration in the Philippines remain to be key areas of consideration. And before I comment on how we think Philippines is doing on that, then let me just also mention that we had a survey on future of work. Preliminary results showed that the adoption of skeletal hybrid work setup has been very effective here. So it's great to see that agility. Unable to determine when they would prefer the resumption of face-to-face activities, so no extreme urge there either. And vaccination of individuals and a lower rate of COVID-19 infections was absolutely decisive. And that is where it becomes, I would say, more relevant to look at the actual numbers, because we keep hearing that Metro Manila is fully vaccinated, that more than 80% and latest 92% of the target has been accomplished. But let's not fool ourselves, and especially not try to fool somebody who is considering seriously to move into the Philippines with their investments. We are not fully vaccinated in Metro Manila. The target did only include adults, which is 60% of the population. So in reality, we should ignore and not go around and repeat that we are vaccinated, 92% fully vaccinated in Metro Manila, when it is in reality only in the lower 50%. And for the total country, for the first dose, it is barely 30%. It is much lower than Vietnam and Indonesia. Indonesia is the lowest in ASEAN, except from the Philippines, yet they are 50% higher vaccination rate than the Philippines. And they are vaccinating at a rate where those that have already reached over 80% of total population, that is Cambodia, Malaysia, and so on, they will be accompanied at close to 80% within basically weeks by Vietnam, and later, a little bit later, by Indonesia. But Philippines, at the current rate, it is not viable. It has to step up. So much improvement required here. Otherwise, when the world is opening up, the Philippines will suddenly stand out. There could be another wave, and that is when we can't any longer try to claim that we are fully vaccinated. On the foreign direct investments, the inflows, August 2021 was 19.8% year on year. And again, last year was not a bad year. Last year was about over 6 billion, or roughly 6 billion total year. 2 or 3 years ago only, that would have been considered a very good year. And the fact that we year to date are approximately 40% above last year in foreign direct investments, that spells very, very positively for that we are already now seeing the benefits of the improvements in legislations. And we know that there is a high, very high, much higher interest among European nations and countries to invest in ASEAN. And we do manage to gravitate more of those investments to the Philippines than we did previously. Very important. By the way, it is to a high degree Germany, United Kingdom, Switzerland, Sweden, France that are contributing there. On trade, so that was investments, trade very important. The Philippines' top European trade partners were, as mentioned, Germany, Netherlands, France, United Kingdom, Italy, Belgium, and Spain. So not just EU countries, obviously. EU, though, ranked in the Philippines' 4th largest trading partner. When we talk about trading, there is no free trade agreement between ASEAN and EU. There's also no free trade agreement with the Philippines. There is a free trade agreement, however, with Vietnam as the only ASEAN country, closely followed by the Philippines, because we are the only ASEAN country otherwise that have the GSP plus trade preferences. That means that there are long list of commerce that are import duty exempted by EU, so they can be freely traded. I used to spend a long time in my years with Dole, their plantation down in Davao, and pineapples actually import free in terms of duty going to EU. Would not be the case if it was Del Monte sending pineapples from, say, Thailand. So we just need to pursue this further. So we have talked a lot about how to improve on foreign investments and the operating environment to attract the investments in the Philippines. We have come a long way there. I think we should try to shift back and discuss more how can we further the free trade agreements. And on that note, since we are not, ECCP is not just EU, so it's interesting here to see EFTA has, and that's Switzerland, Norway, and so on, already signed a free trade agreement with all of ASEAN, and therefore obviously including the Philippines. So on the free trade agreements, right now it is so that EU-Thailand free trade agreement negotiations were resumed very recently, August 2021. EU-Indonesia free trade negotiations were launched in July 2016. EU, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. These are for all types of countries, if I can say so, because there was a free trade agreement entered with Korea approximately 10, 12 years ago. There's with Canada, I believe there's also been one entered now with Japan. So it's not just developing countries. What needs to be said here in order for EU to be motivated is that either there have to be significant trade going on. It's not yet at that level with the Philippines, but it can also be other values such as where they feel that in order to further, for example, inclusive growth and good corporate social responsibility, good governing by the government, then that will also be honored then by EU in order to further the free trade discussions. So I'm going to skip out on these because I don't want to take too much time, but thank you for now, and I'm looking forward to a lot of sharp questions. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Lars. Yeah, we will go back. I saw that last slide you flashed. We will certainly go back to those initiatives and discuss it during the open forum. So we have, last but not the least, and the other member of this second panel, Mr. Chris Humphrey, our friend, Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council. Primary voice for European business within the whole ASEAN region. He is a business development and government relations professional, more than 30 years experience across public and private sectors, over 15 years here in Asia. I think he's rather well known, no? Among the European chambers of Southeast Asia, certainly to be able to give us some insight by talking about enhancing trade and investment between Europe and ASEAN. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chris Humphrey.
Good morning, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me here to speak to you today. I'm Chris Humphrey, the Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council. And I've been asked today to speak to you about the trade and investment climate between the EU and ASEAN, and how that indeed can be enhanced going forward. So I will take you through some slides today on this issue. First thing to talk about really is that the trade and investment relationship between the EU and ASEAN has traditionally been extremely strong. The EU for a long time was the largest source of foreign direct investment to the region, as the chart in the bottom left here is showing, and then has also traditionally been the second largest trading partner as well. Those two charts you see on the left actually are the figures over a 10-year period. Unfortunately, if we looked at the last couple of years, the EU's ranking has slipped. We've gone down to third on FDI flows, and we've gone down to third also on trading goods with the region. But overall, the relationship's been very strong. And I think the important part for ASEAN, actually, the balance of trade is very much in ASEAN's favor. In other words, they're exporting a lot more to the EU than the EU is sending back to Southeast Asia. FDI picture has been a bit mixed. Last year, the US was by far the biggest source of FDI to the region. You can see this in the chart in the bottom right-hand corner of your screens at the moment. And you can see that the numbers have really fluctuated up and down over a period of time. But I think the key thing is Europe is a large investor in the region. Actually, we have more FDI stock in the region than any other dialogue partner of ASEAN. And I think the investments the EU has made have been long-term investments as well. European companies, many of our members here at the Business Council, have actually been operating in Southeast Asia for many, many decades, indeed some for well over a century now. Every year, the Business Council does a survey of European industry in the region. This year, the results were a mixed bag, as they often are. There was some good news for Southeast Asia, in that 63% were expecting an increase in profits in ASEAN. The same number saw ASEAN as the region of best economic opportunity. And the important thing there, by the way, that gap between ASEAN and the next region of best economic opportunity, which was China, has actually widened. And 82% are looking to increase the level of investment in the region over the next 5 years. In every case, those numbers were a sharp increase over 2020. But I must say the 2020 survey was done right at the height of the beginning of the pandemic last year. There is less good news, I must say, for the region. Only 2% think that ASEAN's economic integration program is progressing fast enough. And 6%, only 6%, think that it's achieved its key aim of being a highly integrated and cohesive economy and of creating a single market and production base. And that was a drop over the numbers from last year. Worse still, 81% think there are too many barriers to the efficient use of supply chains in the region. At a time when ASEAN is trying to position itself as a center for investment, a place to relocate supply chains to, this number, I think, is particularly worrying for the region. And 3%, only 3% think that NTBs, non-tariff barriers to trade, are decreasing. And that was a big drop over 2020 when the number is at 14%. And we'll look deeper into this matter shortly. Now, I think it's true to say that ASEAN has not been short on ideas. On your screen now, you've got a whole range of agreements, roadmaps, framework agreements, work plans, action plans, a whole bunch of things that ASEAN has been trying to do to push along economic integration in the region and improve its attractiveness of foreign investment from all of its dialogue partners, not just the EU. I think what you're seeing on screen will probably tell you that if anything, ASEAN is trying to do far too much and is perhaps losing sight of the great prizes. I must say, when I first came into this job, reading the original AEC Blueprint 2015, you'd read it and you think what they're going to achieve is absolutely fantastic, beyond belief. Well, unfortunately, it probably has been beyond belief because they are not delivering on it at the moment. So not short on ideas. What is the perception of delivery? Well, in our survey, as I was mentioning earlier, is ASEAN regional integration progressing fast enough? Well, the answer overwhelmingly is no, and that the numbers saying no this year have gone up quite a lot from previous years as well. And have the objectives been achieved? As I mentioned earlier, only 6% saying yes for that. So we as a business community have some concerns about ASEAN and its approach. We would say actually it's now 10 separate countries. ASEAN is not really functioning as a block of 10. The power of 10 is in fact being lost. There has been some progress, there's no doubt about that. Big progress on tariff elimination for intra-ASEAN movements of goods. That gets a big tick. But there are major concerns. There are major concerns over non-tariff barriers in the region, over the harmonization of standards, which is progressing extremely slowly. I mean, one example is the agreement for automotive standards in the region, which took something like 10 years to negotiate, and then took another 12 months to find ink in their pens to actually sign the agreement, and it's still not implemented. Simplification, automation of customs procedures, another area. I must say, though, to give some credit to customs authorities across Southeast Asia, they have been making steady progress on this. We do have the ASEAN single window. Many of them are moving more and more to fully automated systems, and that should be applauded. And then we also then have the ongoing review and modernization of the ASEAN Trades in Goods Agreement. That agreement is now 11 years old. It is not fully implemented, but they are now conducting a review of it. And we really do hope they can bring it to be a modern agreement. It needs to include things like coverage for e-commerce. It needs a modernized customs chapter. It needs stronger rules around non-tariff barriers put inside it. And it also needs to include things like protection of IP. More than on the issue of NTBs. I mean, ASEAN has seen a steady rise in the number of non-tariff measures in the region. It's something like a 60% increase since 2015. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. I always say at meetings when I'm talking about NTMs and NTBs in the region, the more NTMs you have can often be seen as a sign of regulatory maturity. You are regulating things. You're trying to protect public health and safety. You're trying to make sure that standards are high. Nothing wrong with that at all. The problem is when some of those NTMs cross the boundary into protectionism or into market control or price control or quantity control areas, and you start having more and more non-tariff barriers. Now, Brunei, for their chairmanship for this year, had as one of their top priorities for the year dealing with NTMs. They came out with an NTM toolkit just over a month or so ago now, which was meant to be a system which member states can use to look at their existing non-tariff measures, carry out an assessment of them and work out whether they are fit for purpose or whether they are overly restrictive or whether they are indeed NTBs. Unfortunately, that toolkit is not compulsory to use, and nor is reporting on it compulsory. So it remains to be seen as to whether it's going to be an actually used toolkit or whether it's going to gather dust at the back of the shed. And what's the problem with NTBs? Well, as I mentioned earlier, very few of our companies in our survey thought that NTBs are decreasing. Indeed, 38% thought they're actually increasing. And that's a worrying sign at a time when ASEAN is trying to make itself more competitive globally and attract more FDI. And I could have put up on here now a whole bunch of quotes from various ASEAN statements and agreements and work plans and blueprints talking about how they're going to eliminate NTBs. I've just chosen two here. The top one is from the AEC Blueprint 2025. Accelerate work towards the full elimination of non-tariff barriers. It's a very slow moving car. I think they put the handbrake on for this one. And underneath it here is one from the midterm review of the AEC, which was conducted earlier this year. And again, they're talking about the need to accelerate the pace of implementation, but there's not much acceleration going on. And why are barriers important? Well, you know, when you're looking at supply chains, you need to have as few barriers as you can because you want your goods to move quickly from one place to the other. And if you're looking to attract FDI, you need to be making sure that your barriers are as low as possible and that those supply chains can function properly. As I mentioned earlier, 81% of our respondents think that supply chain barriers are too many at the moment. But equally, 87% said if you took them away, we would increase our use of regional supply chains. In other words, we'd make more investment in ASEAN. We would use more goods from ASEAN companies. We would be supporting more MSMEs in the region. And that is why it's absolutely critical that all of the region, the Philippines included, actually start to move on this issue. All that said, I mentioned earlier, our members, European companies still think ASEAN is a great place. Perhaps not collectively, but certainly as individual markets. And here's the reason why. 12 great, strong reasons why businesses should be looking at ASEAN, paying more attention to ASEAN, why the European Union should be paying more attention to ASEAN as well. Not only are you going to have soon the fifth or the fourth largest economy in the world, if you take it as a collective, you've got 640 million people. That's a huge consumer base. You've got the third largest labor market in the world. You've got a huge amount of growing online internet users, e-commerce markets. I mean, the numbers here are actually quite staggering. You've got a growing middle class as well. And you've got a particularly young population at the moment, and you need to be leveraging that, that sort of population dividend much more than you currently are as well. So the opportunities are massive. The market is massive, and positioned correctly, you should be making sure that you become a natural choice for businesses to come and invest in. The other great thing I think about ASEAN actually is some of the things you've been doing on the trade front as a grouping as well. RCEP was a tremendous deal to get over the line. It was very hard work, years of painful negotiation, but it's over the line. It is now a trade deal covering 30% of the world's population and 30% of the world's GDP. And one of the key things about it really is it does put in place a trade deal for the first time involving China, Japan, and South Korea in a single deal. Lots of good things that it does. You got them here on the chart. I won't read them out to you. There are things that it doesn't do. And from a European perspective, some of these are very important. If the European Union is looking at doing a deal with all of ASEAN, some of these items on the right-hand side of this chart are things that the EU will have to, they'll have no choice, to raise and try and include in an agreement. To things around environmental protection and government subsidies, government procurement issues, labour rights issues, more enforcement of IP, etc., are things that will have to be put into an agreement. And they're things that are presently absent in RCEP. Looking at the bigger trade picture here, and I've mapped out here, you know, what ASEAN has got with its various different partners. And you'll see in the EU column, there's not a lot of green here, and that is a very unfortunate. The EU has, in our view, not been acting quick enough at getting trade deals over the line. We've only got one FTA with Singapore and Vietnam at the moment, but they are extremely high quality, they are very deep, and they are very comprehensive agreements. The EU said in its own words, the one with Vietnam was the most significant and comprehensive FTA they've negotiated with an emerging economy. And I think anything that the EU is going to try and do with the rest of the region will have to look very, very similar to those two FTAs themselves. So they have ongoing negotiations at the moment with Indonesia. They're moving slowly, and that hasn't been helped by the pandemic. The negotiators have been doing their best, doing things over Zoom calls, but you can't negotiate a full-blown FTA via Zoom. You really have got to be sitting down in the same room and going through it line by line on the text and working out issues with each other and making compromises with each other. So hopefully, if things start to ease up, fingers crossed, they can get back around the same table in the same rooms and actually try and push that one over the line. Great progress has been made. Unfortunately, progress with the others is very slow. Negotiations with the Philippines have been parked for some time. They're also parked with Thailand and Malaysia, and that's all for different reasons. There is some hope that Thailand will come back on the scene very, very soon. And then the other arrangements are in place here in the Philippines. Of course, you have GSP Plus with the EU, which is a big help for you. And there's everything but arms agreements in place for Myanmar and Cambodia and Laos. Cambodia and Myanmar, of course, have had some of those provisions suspended for various reasons. So where are we going next with EU-ASEAN relations? Well, they were elevated to a strategic partnership at the end of 2020, very much welcomed by us and the European business community. We're looking forward to some deeper engagement. The EU itself is already quite heavily engaged with the region on things like sustainable development and energy transition, and sustainable finance and connectivity issues. There's a lot of work that happens on the political security side of life as well, and also on the socio-cultural side of life, particularly around support for tertiary education issues as well. There is on the trade front a working group looking at the possibility of an EU-ASEAN FTA. But I don't think any of us should hold our breath on that for the moment. There is a big ambition gap between the two sides. They are trying to find ways to bridge it. And the EU, by the way, is a significant supporter for ASEAN. I think the largest source of overseas development aid for the region. Over 2 billion euros has been spent with the region. More than 200 million euros of that goes to the ASEAN Secretariat in support of ASEAN regional integration. And there's a lot more money and programs coming down the pipe too. So why the strategic partnership? I think it was just a natural thing. The EU is ASEAN's longest standing dialogue partner. Moving towards it was a natural thing to do. It wasn't very easy. There were a number of issues that had to be overcome. As a result, though, there are now significant areas for cooperation. On the economic side, support for circular economy development. We've got ASEAN's recent circular economy framework that's come out, and I think the EU will provide a lot of support to try and put meat on the bones of that for them. Certainly we at the Business Council, we're looking to getting more and more involved in that area. A lot of help on fiscal and financial stability issues. They also, by the way, are natural bedfellows when it comes to fair trade and international rules-based mechanisms in the trade space, and a lot of things there. And I think the EU will do a lot more things around support on labour rights and creating jobs. I mentioned just now the security side of life. One big push from the EU with ASEAN, and ASEAN wants help on it, is fighting against transnational crime issues. And that's an area which I think not many people see work happening, but it is a big area of collaboration between the two blocs. On sustainable and connectivity issues, a lot of work on transport linkages. We have the Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement in place now, which was the second region-to-region air transport agreement. It could have been the first if people had moved it slightly quicker. But that should really help boost air transport links between the two regions once we get past these pandemic issues at the moment. So what's the future hold? There are undoubtedly concerns and irritants, and I don't think we should try and push these under the carpet. They exist and they do need to be dealt with. Palm oil has for a long time been one of them. Fortunately, that seems to be a little bit of a lesser concern at the moment, since a working group involving Indonesia and Malaysia and the EU was established. They seem to be working through some of those issues. Of course, Malaysia and Indonesia have both taken the EU to the WTO on that, and that's a process which will be slow, but will work through some of those issues. Problems with Cambodia, Myanmar, and the Philippines as well. These are largely political problems. EU has concerns about human rights issues in Cambodia. Of course, the military regime currently sitting in Naypyidaw in Myanmar is not a help in terms of relations, and they also have some concerns, let's be blunt about it, with the Philippines as well. Trade negotiations, already covered those. They're progressing slow. Certainly, I think people at this end here in Southeast Asia would like to see some faster progress on it. I know the Thais are pushing quite hard to get things restarted. I know the Philippines would like to get things restarted as well. Business wants to get things restarted. And then there's new EU legislation on deforestation, which has just come out, which I think is going to cause some concern, particularly in Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta. We hope it doesn't, but I think if you're just reading it for the first time, you'll be having a sharp intake of breath. But there are positives and there are opportunities. Some of those are again in the trade space. There's the possibility of an EU-ASEAN investment protection agreement. That's something that we would like to see as a precursor to a full-blown region-to-region FTA. There's the bilateral trade agreements in place already with Singapore and Vietnam, and the hope and expectation that more will follow behind those. And eventually, at some point, there will be a region-to-region FTA. It's just a question of time, I think, for that one. Energy transition, it's a big area. ASEAN needs help. The EU is willing to provide that help. There are EU lending institutions prepared to get involved with financing. There are actually financial programs coming from the EU themselves to help the region on this. And European industry is a leader on energy transition issues. It's something that the region wants to do. After COP26, we saw Vietnam in particular signing up to carbon net zero targets. Earlier ones and others offering to retire their coal-fired power stations. And I think this is an area where the EU can really, really develop the relationship with ASEAN. And again, on sustainable finance, most European lenders, most European financial institutions, whether they are public or private, are very big on this now and are willing to get involved and willing to support ASEAN. And with ASEAN now having its own taxonomy for sustainable finance, I think the path is going to be a lot clearer for European companies to get more involved in that space. Connectivity and infrastructure, another area. A lot of support here from the EU. Now, you don't go around, you won't see airports with a brass plaque on the outside saying built by the European Union, like you do with ones built by China or by Japan or by Korea. But the EU puts a lot of work into connectivity stuff with the EU. It's support behind the scenes, it's working on planning, it's working on contracts, it's working on all the practical stuff that you have to do in order to get your infrastructure built. Education, another area, huge support from the EU, particularly through its SHARE program, support for students going to the EU and European students coming here and sharing of knowledge, and helping children, helping young adults here in Southeast Asia get through tertiary education programs. The Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement I've already mentioned, and there is then the ASEAN EU Plan of Action, which runs through until next year. They are working on a new one after that. And that plan of action encompasses all the things that I've just talked about. So personally, I am actually quite optimistic about the future of EU-ASEAN relations. I think they will get stronger, they will get deeper. European industry, of course, is extremely supportive of the region, being long-term investors here, as I mentioned. And I think we will get those extra trade deals over the line. And that means that you will, as countries in the region, begin to see more and more FDI flowing into the region from the EU. With that, I will leave you, and thank you very much again for inviting me to present to you today.
Thank you very much, Chris, for ending on an optimistic note. And I hope, although Chris is not with us today, we'll still take into account all of his discussion about the ASEAN aspect, no? Because it's not just us. It's also about us working together with ASEAN and with the European Union. Okay, this takes us to our open forum, where I hope we can clarify certain issues, provide more insights from the speakers who are with us. So we still have Riza, we still have Boss June and Boss George, and we have Lars, who were with us. And we now have an open forum of all the panelists that were with us this morning. Please, to be able to, if you want to ask a question, addressing and asking the audience to please send your question either by the Q&A or chat function, Zoom, and then I'll read it out for you. And then I would advise that, because we are really focusing on, not just focusing on our development and our growth prospects, and trying to attract investment in general, but particularly a partnership with the European, not with Europe, not just the European Union, but also the EFTA member states, the whole of Europe. How can we work in partnership with Europe to overcome the problems that were presented by and highlighted by the pandemic, but also to take us further to a more solid and dynamic situation, far removed from what we were before. We're just constantly lagging behind because we refuse to change antiquated and old regulatory barriers that served only to enrich a few and does not really address the larger picture of inclusion and bringing all the population out of poverty and into a state of development and hope. All right. So we have no questions coming in yet from the audience. I do have a few questions, some guide questions. We'll probably begin our discussion. So maybe particularly, well, all our panelists. I have a question here that was given as a guide. What would be the best way to ensure business continuity in the event of another surge and a lockdown? And that's we fear we don't want it to happen, but we also have to be mindful that anything goes with this virus. Is there any particular maybe measure or idea you would have if you could advise our leadership what to do in case a surge does happen and the threat of a lockdown does occur?
Well, if I may start, I mean, clearly the businesses have been people and businesses have been very resilient, very agile. Change offers opportunity. We have all been forced to learn about hybrid working from home. It has been very valuable lessons, and it will actually become a legacy that will stay with us, improving productivity and so on. But it has been very harsh also to push the businesses for as long as has been the case with the prolonged lockdowns in the Philippines. Some businesses have simply not survived, perhaps because their industries were already lacking towards the end. However, when you listen to the biggest banks, for example, BPI, their new CEO, TG, there was an interview with him in an article, and TG stated, while the banks are more liquid than ever because people can't spend their money, and if they still have their jobs, they save up, then what they can tell is that the small, medium enterprises, and that's a very big chunk of our economy here, as we know, they have really, and he said this in August when we had the most recent hard lockdown, he said they have depleted their reserves. So if there is another surge, that's your question, I think we need, with due diligence, to organize and think about how to support and alleviate, because if we ask them to hold their breath one more time, I'm not so sure that they're going to make it through another lockdown.
Riza?
If I may, go ahead.
Or
Who do you want?
no, go ahead, Riza. Ladies
Okay.
first, then we'll go to Boss George.
Okay.
Well, I just wanted to say, it's going to be hard to prevent another surge if we continue to, if we disregard the health protocols. I think in other countries you're seeing the surge, one because of the unvaccinated that continue to spread the virus, but even among the vaccinated who catch it, there's been a relaxation, non-wearing of masks, not following social distancing, and all of that. So I think we need to try to continue to avoid that surge, but also prepare for a surge if it does come, which means expanding our testing capability, our tracing. It was mentioned earlier. I think it was by Mr. Ortiz Luis or George that you should have a unified contact tracing system. And then we have to expand our whole healthcare facilities. Because if you look at other countries, they've had far more cases, some of them, than we have, but they never had to lock down because their healthcare facilities could handle it. And the other advantage now is with so many people vaccinated, you find that the fatality rate is already 1/10 what it used to be. Not as many people have to be hospitalized. So we really need to continue to accelerate our vaccination and prepare for the next surge. because there's really not much you can do when a surge happens. And then the government has to be, if you know, if we're not ready, we're going to be locked down again. And as was mentioned earlier, it's going to be really hard. And I think for the government, if that does happen, the subsidy should really be targeted already, to really the small businesses, the transport sector, and so on.
George?
I'll let I'll let June go ahead, seniority. June.
Go ahead, you. Actually, I didn't hear the question because I went out.
Ah,
Anyway, baka,
George.
yeah, just adding to what Risa just said, no? And I have really shared my thoughts with the Secretary Anyo and also Charlie Galvez. I said, we have to bring the testing, the rapid testing, that's more affordable to the barangay level.
Mm,
You cannot, we cannot wait until there's a surge. We have to take into the loop the populace. They have to be in the loop. We have to encourage the honor system. Have them test, in the family, the productive uh, individual in the family can test the older people, test the children. You remember, our schools are closed for the last year and a half. We need to open that, okay? But we really need to make those affordable, and to catch it early. We cannot wait. What happened, I think, in other countries like Singapore, UK, Austria, and developed countries. Their vaccination rate is pretty high. It's about 65 to 75%. Yet they've experienced these surges. And definitely this comes through the breakthrough. There's no guarantee that you're not going to get infected. It's just that it attenuates the degree of the illness. But for us to open up and hopefully not to have a reset, is really do mass testing, not the PCR test. It's too costly. It's too complicated. You need the laboratory of class 3 level. But the anti-rapid antigen test, I think, should be deployed. Really to the grassroots. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Boss June, did you want to hear the question?
Yeah, no, it's okay. I more or less get the drift, though.
Okay.
Actually, I think our problem is over reliance too much on lockdown,
Mm.
and the decision process has been sort of lopsided. We have been advocating since last year. We wrote a letter. Many of the associations, I think, almost all of us wrote that letter, which says that the first thing that we must not let go is improving our health system, and therefore we should take care that all our hospitals are ready and willing to be able to. But that did not happen because what happened is they did not pay the hospitals. They did not give the proper benefits to our frontliners, our nurses and doctors were resigning. It's a good thing that the numbers were really going down, but and therefore the hospital care system sort of lightened up, no? But I think we should have declared earlier opening since September.
Mm.
But the ones under the system who will decide who about the opening will be the Department of Health under the system. And the big reason, the big problem is at the time they were not sure whether the health system can meet another surge, so they refuse and they say we're not ready. Until now, until it's zero, I don't think they will say they were ready
Mm.
for opening. No, so it's really a question of to me it's a uh, uh, that the one who will decide is the one who is guilty of that preparing it. No, it's just lucky that numbers were going down, not because they have done anything special. The vaccination continued, went up a little bit more. but nothing else has been done, and yet it's been going down. And if a surge happen, as is happening in Europe and in other parts of the world, I think in a few days, our health system will be overrun again,
Mm.
and that is the problem. Why are not they concentrating? And George has mentioned testing, and Risa has mentioned also. We should concentrate on testing. We should make it free. People are not afraid of getting COVID now. They're being afraid of testing positive because they don't know what will happen to them if they test positive. They will lose their work. They will, and they even have to pay for the test. So I think we should concentrate on those.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Lockdown presupposes a certain lack of discipline. No? Boss Jun, do you think we're capable of policing ourselves? In other words, you know what the protocols are. Sometimes, I wonder about people. They like to post pictures of themselves doing things that are against protocol because they're at the beach or at a party. Or something. But do you think we can generally actually our both our
Tony,
labor people?
if I may continue, Tony,
Sige, sige, Jun.
we're the only one in the whole world who was convinced that there is science behind the face mask, the
Or
face shield.
Face
face
shield.
shield.
They were able to justify that. The whole world, some even refused the face mask, but we were able to justify that it's science that dictates that what kind of cooperation do you want from the people? It's the
That's
people who is cooperating, but the one implementing are not the ones behind.
mm,
Look at the transport system, they're behind. Look at the health system, they're behind.
mm,
Uh, Now we have a lot of vaccines, but I don't know if they can really pull through this vaccine, because they lack vaccinators.
yeah.
I'm afraid that sometimes they might even use security guards to vaccine us, just to be able to dispose of the vaccines that are expiring.
Anyway, Tony, just to share some observation.
Mm,
The testing that they are doing on the average lately, it's below 50,000, which is quite
mm,
low.
yeah.
And we're getting the infection rate of like below 1,000. I think, and we all agree, Riza and Mr. Ortiz, that this should continue and at a higher level. We should
Yeah.
be testing at least 100 to 120,000 a day
Ambios, yeah.
for us to have the true picture. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, on the other side, since the vaccination inoculation program has been deployed for the last 6 months, okay,
Mm,
so I was looking at the macro data. Our fatality rate is still the same
Nandito sila
1.65%.
Mark yun, sayang.
It did not drop. You know,
Gusto ko pang
prior to the
sila,
vaccination and after the
sila
vaccination,
nila.
the fatality or morbidity rate is still 1.65%. I'm not saying that the vaccine is not effective, but what I'm saying is the impact on this COVID-19, no? Whether
Mm.
you're vax or unvax, you still have that rate of people dying. Okay? All the reset before was done because they want to flatten the curve. And what we mean by flattening the curve is the health service, the healthcare service should be prepared. Okay, should have prepared in the sense that the government spends so much money, paying for the contact tracing. They should just take out the contact tracing and use that money to hire more nurses and doctors,
mm,
facilities. There was a rush of put up facilities all over the World Trade Center, Rizal Memorial, and some other areas. But now they are completely unused. And taking off our concern about surges, I think they should be preparing for that already. Because I'm sure if other countries has experienced that, we will experience the surges also. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah,
thank you.
I just wanted to make a quick
Yes.
comment on the case fatality rate. No, George, I think you might not be seeing a decrease because a lot of the vaccinated are asymptomatic.
Mm,
Okay. No,
So
I'm looking at the mass number. We have about our deaths about 46,000. Okay, 46, 47,000, and the number of infection is about 2.8
Yeah.
0.9 million. So using those numbers, basically it's about that rate of fatality is about 1.65%. But
Yeah.
any death, of course, should be avoided. Okay?
Yeah. But I think the study in PGH showed the fatality rate if you're unvaccinated is like something like 16 times higher.
Yes, it's more for the unvaccinated.
Yeah. Because you're
That's
not
it.
detecting the vaccinated anymore because they're asymptomatic.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'm
And
only saying that no, not to discourage people from vaccination.
and one thing we may not know is that it's like what the doctor shared with me about the dengue. He said, a lot of our people living in the slum area, they got dengue, whether knowingly or unknowingly, they passed through the stage, they got cured, okay, without taking any medication. And I think for us, and I believe that the physiology of the Filipinos are sturdier stock than the Caucasian. I'm sorry about that, Lars, but if you look at the data, we are 1/3 the population of US, but the number of infection in US is 20 times our number of infection. The number of deaths is 20 times in US compared to our population. While we're only 1/3, we're 110 million. There are 330 million. Even if you compare the data with Europe, it's reflective that the sense that the Filipino are, I don't know, sturdier because of circumstances. Thank you.
I agree with that. Actually, you also there are different things that plays into that. But anyway, besides being a foreigner, I'm also a Viking, so I hope that adds a little bit to my resilience. One issue here that we have not brought up, that is the regulations in order to be more preventive and so on. Many good regulations also about showing that now we have to prove that we are vaccinated to fly and so on. But what about the laws? Because often there's a conflict between the regulations, which I agree with, they could actually be heightened a lot, and then the law itself. Examples, we see it every day. We go into a restaurant as a guest. Well, I don't know whether it's the case still. I believe it is level 2. I show that I'm vaccinated, and they, at least at the higher levels, they had to be vaccinated in order the employees. Meanwhile, that's contradicting the law because Department of Labor would say that's illegal. So now we have regulations contradicting the laws. I won't mention who the senator was, but I brought it up to a senator and the answer was, Lars, ignore the law. So at least we can agree there's a conflict.
I guess, Tony, the litmus test is this comes December. Filipinos, when it comes to December, somehow they would just throw out all of these protocols out the window.
But I think
I'm sorry to say that, but there are only certain areas that are really frequented, or patronized by the income earner in the Class D and Class C, and those are very congested areas, like Divisoria and all of these places, and it's unavoidable. I've seen a photo that was shared to me about people lining up to commute public transportation. They practice protocol, 2 meters apart, but once they're on the jeep, they're squeezed together. So it's hard really to deal with that. That's why I feel that the continued testing and really even the providing, I think, the necessary vitamins is important for immunity boost up their immunity. We can't afford another lockdown, and as June was saying, that the government should be more proactive. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
One last, if
Yes,
I may, another issue that we didn't bring up yet: the green lanes for the mobility in and out of the country. The vast majority of the countries that are on the green lane remain North Korea and similar. And within ASEAN, it is only green lane for Indonesia. I have no idea why. And not Thailand, where actually at least we could have been reciprocal, because we can easily fly into Thailand being fully vaccinated without being quarantined, at least in a hotel. So I think it is really important to revisit that very, very quickly. And the discussion right now is to ease it for OFWs, but I assume that means that it will not include the easing will not include foreigners, and therefore foreigners will need to be able to travel in and out in the interest of foreign investments.
All right, thank you. I'm mindful of the time. We've extended the open forum, so we can still get a few more questions in. But I think we can now, we're thinking about COVID, of course, always at the top of our mind. But some important insights are beyond vaccination. It's really about improving our healthcare for everyone, for all.
Tony, can we deviate a bit? I think we're talking about really balance between life and livelihoods, and I think our legislators play a role as far as the bills that's necessary for us to attract more foreign direct investments, and the Public Service Act and the Foreign Investment Acts. I think they're foot dragging. This has been talked about in the lower house and the Senate, and it hasn't been passed. And these are really key issues for us to move ahead. Every year we have about close to about 700,000 new entry to the labor force. Riza and I were both members of the Philippine Business for Education. And without really vast investments, both locally and foreign direct investments, it's not fair to the young people because they can't find a job. So I hope the legislators are aware that their foot dragging is not doing us any good. So those are the things that and also the ease of doing business. Well, I have to give credit to Arta, the Secretary General of BEHICA. He's been doing a good job. Okay. And I think he can push the envelope further to ease to have our country be more attractive in the radar for investment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. I'm glad you brought that up because I remember Lars had a slide that he skipped over, but it was about these important measures that have been certified already as urgent, being pushed by DTI and NEDA and DOF. But perhaps there are, I know you, well, I've witnessed this sort of foot dragging, with regard to the legislation. But perhaps, well, we know the political economy of the Philippines. Perhaps there are certain interests that don't want these measures to be passed because they're protected. They have big economic interests to protect, but they don't want competition coming from.
The word there is a regulatory capture.
Yeah. So, well, that takes me to a question that was raised raised in the chat box. How can business organizations like yours help in the policy advocacy to help the economy recover, especially with this business scenario coming up about presidential elections? And it's sort of like a big virus or pandemic that will be coming next year, and it always complicates things. Do you have any insights on maybe how the business organizations will be working in spite or with this presidential election coming up and with everything that we've discussed?
Yeah. I think
if I may, because I'm really challenged or engaged a lot by foreigners, and since our chamber represents so many countries, and there are actually 8 all new ambassadors that have just arrived, and none of the foreign ambassadors have been here at an election before. So I have lunches and even breakfast meetings with almost daily with foreign ambassadors and of course companies, etc. So it's very important that we can give perspective. Clearly, foreign governments will have concerns about what if this one is elected instead of another, investors about uncertainties and so on. It's very important to explain that actually, for example, this economy is not as
You've
dependent
lost the
on...
voice of Lars.
No,
Pardon?
I can
no,
hear
we
Lars.
can hear him.
Yeah, thanks. This economy, what I always say is this economy is not as dependent on foreign investments and international trade as comparable economies in Southeast Asia. Secondly, this economy is to a much higher degree depending on domestic consumption. Therefore, it's very important to highlight to foreign business leaders, ambassadors, and so on, that actually domestic consumption always increases during election year, always. So at least from now on until the end of May, we are going to see a spike in GDP simply because of domestic consumption increasing. That's for sure. I worked for Coca-Cola in 1998, and that year we sold more Coca-Cola in the Philippines than in China, and it was only because it was an election year.
So Lars,
So-
you're also into Coke.
I've been working for Dole and for Coca-Cola and so on. Yes, I walked the barangays of Tondo and Caloocan to set up distribution for these foreign companies before doing what I'm doing today. So I've literally walked the talk. It's important that they appreciate that there actually are positive effects while we still do not know what is the policy is going to be on the other side. And then just state the fact that foreign direct investments are up 41% year to date. And we all know that there's an election coming up. So there is an enormous resilience, not just in the Philippines, but actually among the foreign investors that are gravitating towards the Philippines, much more so than the investors that are gravitating towards Malaysia and Thailand that I mentioned earlier, because those went to literally zero last year because of elections and political and issues with the questions about a king and stuff like that.
Riza?
No, I was about to say that I think you have the perfect person to answer that question because George is the chair of the LEDAC.
Because
it's on you.
You're right, Mr. Whitting. Based on past data, an election year somehow pumps up our GDP by the study that I read, almost 0.5 to 0.6%. So that's a lot of spending. Okay. But having said that, the Philippine economy is a consumer-based economy, basically because of the remittances. We have so much money coming in, 35 billion US dollars. And those are really that's keeping the economy afloat all these years. Okay. Our export has increased, in the last decade or so, but due to the COVID-19, it slowed down by about 15%. But as I mentioned earlier, with the world's economy opening up, we're finding a rebound to exports. But we're now saddled with cargo vessels constraints, and also sea freight rates has been very high. But having said that, I think we have this alert system that is being implemented now through Alert 2, hopefully can be sustained for the remaining period. One thing that I'd like the government, whether this present dispensation and new government, is COVID-19 is not going to go away, but they have to bring on board the private sector. Okay, when the IFTA was set up, even up to now, you'd notice that most of them were military men, and none from the private sectors that are on board. Of course, we get consulted. But moving forward, I think there should be more collaboration with the different business group, PCCI, Philexport, MPZ, and the likes. And they're doing that, but in the decision making, I think we're out of the loop. sort of say. Hopefully that can be done. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess maybe wanted to add, Tony, to what was mentioned by George. One of the ways by which the private sector influences, aside from coordination to the LEDAC, which is the Government and Business Coordinating Council through which we lobby for reforms that we want. We prepare position papers, and FEF is quite active in that, preparing position papers which we present to the different government agencies. For this election, we're also inviting the candidates through in various fora to present their program, their plan of action. It's also an opportunity to ask them questions so that we can understand what their platform is and what they plan to do, and for us to also present our ideas on what should be done to moving forward.
Tony, maybe we can ask June to answer that, because we just had our Philippine Business Conference last week. And we
That's right.
invited all the presidential aspirants to share with us their thoughts. Maybe Mr. Ortiz can share with us.
Was there anything interesting you heard, Boss June?
Our idea really now is, I think we have to change tack now. As George mentioned, the representation in the IATF is really, perhaps at the beginning, at the onset, that might be good. But in the recovery period, I think they should take the private sector more in. No? They have always, from the very start, they have always said it's whenever we want some relaxation, and whenever the private sector says something, and it's not heeded, the answer is always it's health against economy. And how can you? But the reality now, it's not health against economy. It is COVID against all health issues, including mental, plus peace and order and criminality and economy. That's the thing that's so if there is a thing that if there are chances that you have to take, we have to take it in favor of relaxation, because we have to move on. I thought last August, when we after the last lockdown, we had already a consensus that we have to live with the COVID. But until now, it's not being practiced. We are still living in the idea that we all our efforts, our resources, and attention should be devoted to COVID. No, COVID is not a big killer in the Philippines, and I think what is happening now is a cycle. 100 years ago, when we had the influenza in the Philippines, and Spanish flu, it killed 70 to 90,000 estimate in 26 months. No vaccine, no nothing. After 26 months, it became an endemic. And we're having vaccine flu shot every year almost, because it's an endemic. It disappeared. I think that is what is happening in the Philippines now. Without doing much anything, we're gambling too much on vaccination. We're not doing much anything about more than that. And I think I think we should look at other ways to be able to fight this and to move on. We cannot leave. A lot of our people are still hungry. That is why we were saying, well, they open up. We're grateful that now they might even thinking of December as something that we will move to the alert system 1. But we were saying that if we did it gradually, starting September, hundreds of thousands of people could have worked already. And because of the introduction of the granular lockdown, what happened is basically those who are not allowed to work yet, especially those in the non-essential business, they lost their ayudas. The only one giving ayudas are when we change system are the ones in the granular lockdown. But how about them? They are not able to work, and now we're even imitating what others are doing. which are not good models anyway, that even employees who are not vaccinated, not to their fault, should not be hired or should be discriminated upon, and yet it's not their fault. In the provinces, it's hardly 40% that has been vaccinated.
Yeah.
We're boasting that 70% in Manila or Metro Manila is, but that is their target market. That is not the population.
Yeah.
If you look at the population, there's still a lot of vaccination that has to go on. We have to live with the COVID, and we have to use all other things aside from vaccine to fight it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I may comment once
Tony,
again.
Yes, sure.
I mean,
go ahead.
I think Lars has something to say.
Lars.
I mean, first of all, we have by far the lowest vaccination rate throughout Southeast Asia, by far. And testing is not really even a tool that has been pulled out of the toolbox. So those are two good arguments to further the private sector partnership in improving on these areas. One good fact, a clear fact, not good, but clear fact that underscores the need for the private sector to get further involved here is that when we look at the election campaign, it doesn't seem to be an issue.
Yes.
The lockdowns, the low vaccination rate, the children being locked up in house arrest, no schooling for almost 2 years, and it's not top line bullet points from each and every candidate. This is very puzzling, I can tell you, to foreign governments and foreign investors. But it is just a fact, so let's just realize what are the facts, and then how can we do it better, despite the fact that it's not going to mean anything to who votes for whom, and therefore it will still be a very low priority by the government because it doesn't seem to have any effect on their ability to be elected or re-elected.
I mean, Tony, do you mind if I go back to what Risa was saying earlier about
quickly lang kasi we have to close the panel.
Anyway, what I'd like to, we had the presidential aspirants in our Philippine Business Conference, and all of them shared with some of the questions that we present to them. But one of the key areas that I hope that all of them would keep in mind is really we need to create more jobs, okay? And then, of course, dealing with the COVID pandemic is a given. I mean, everybody talks about that. But what I notice is none of them talk about the debt that we have incurred, okay, for the country. And whoever is going to be the next administration is upon their shoulder to deal with that, okay? And we be on the business side, of course, the money will not just appear. It will come out of the business sector. And that is some sort of a concern for all of us. And thank you, that's all.
Okay. All right, now I have to wind down or conclude this panel, but the most important, well, one of the most important questions I still have to address is about our relationship with Europe, both European Union and EFTA. So in closing, could you just say a few words from all of you, knowing that we were on the verge of continuing the negotiation for Philippines EU FTA. And I like the fact that Vietnam was cited. I envy Vietnam for being bold and actually entering into a bilateral agreement with European Union. We do have the EFTA agreement, but we still need that European Union agreement. And how from our end, what can we do to harness this relationship or partnership we have with Europe to address the problems that we have, particularly about capital formation and capital accumulation, to address poverty and hunger and health? So maybe we should start with you, Lars, since you're the European in the room.
Yeah, the Viking here. I don't want to become too political, of course, because we are a business organization. We really want the free trade agreement. There are two issues here that plays into the equation. and that's why Vietnam got it, by the way. One is there a significant to Europe important significant amount of business interests? And the answer was yes. With Vietnam there was. With the Philippines, not so much, at least not yet. We are working on that, right? The other one is there a good PR story to be told around it, like inclusive growth, etc.? With Vietnam, I would claim at my own account risk that there was very bad PR story behind it. Why? Because, I mean, human rights in Vietnam, please. But in that regard, when it comes to the PR aspect, we need to await the outcome of the election, because if there also is a less favorable PR scenario based on whoever is elected, then it is a little bit of a lose-lose. It's going to be very difficult for me to do my advocacy back in Europe for the free trade. Then there might be one other way to pursue it, and that is what I would do. That is, if they don't agree with the policies of a new government and therefore don't want to favor more, then we should go for, together with the other ASEAN countries, go for a ASEAN EU free trade agreement instead. I think that would be our best second choice.
Yeah. Risa?
Yeah, I agree with getting the FTA signed, first of all, because that should increase the trade volume. And the other one is open up our economy so that we can attract European investments. And you can build a nice PR story around that for the Philippines, because you bring in investments, you create jobs, you bring in new technology, you bring in new skills and knowledge. So if we can open up the economy by finally signing into law all those bills, I think that would help with increasing the trade. Then, of course, addressing all the barriers that are currently there, which make it more difficult and expensive for European companies to be trading with the Philippines. Yeah.
Risa, can I just quick follow-up question? Because so many, I keep hearing this argument where we want to protect the SMEs. That's why we put barriers to investment. Can we say that opening up the economy is actually better for SMEs and more for farmers, fisher folk, inclusion in general, rather than this system that we're supposed to be reserving the economy for Filipinos?
Yeah, I believe so, because you bring in all those investments, like I said, you generate jobs. And then if you bring in, for example, a manufacturer here, you need that network now of supplier industries, which generally are the smaller companies, the MSMEs, that you would help develop. And then when they come in, they also help by developing skills in the MSMEs. So you're also upgrading the skills of the smaller companies, which they would otherwise have no access to without that contact, that linkage with the foreign company that's setting up here.
Thank you. Boss June ba? Or Boss George?
Seniority comes first.
June.
John, your comment.
Well, we have always been known to be proactive in looking for our trade relationships and improving our foreign direct investment. And I think the resistance many times, even with privileged entry here, that sometimes they do not apply because some departments, some groups would always object to them that they cannot comply with the protocols. Uh, Really is they always use the reason the SMEs, no. But the problem of SMEs really is not entry of foreign investment or technology. Problem of SMEs is they're the most underbanked sector in the whole of Asia. The SME of and I think we should improve that. We have passed even our laws regarding force on them, yung Magna Carta for SMEs. It doesn't work. Something the government always find a way for it not to work. No, we have extended it. We're now renewing it again. If so let's not make SME the reason so that we resist foreign entry. We should help SME to be able to access banks, and therefore they should be able to compete, even the ones coming in as small ones. No? That has been proven, I think, in the relaxation of the trade liberalization, which people are resisting. No, but the reality is it always helps that the investment comes in and technology comes in.
Thank you. And Boss George.
Well, I agree with what all the statements made. No? I'd just like to add that, and I've shared this with Secretary Mon Lopez. I said we have to be uh, uh, focused on what industry sector we want to attract the Philippines, and this should go hand in hand with the skill sets that necessary. And we should incentivize trainings at the higher level. We do have to go up the value chain. We cannot rely on low wages to attract foreign investment, but we have to attract them because of the skill sets. And what can be done is that like in Germany, we can attract certain big companies, boss or whatever, in a certain high skill sets. But on the flip side, we can incentivize for them to bring in their equipment tax free and train our workers here. Our Filipinos are highly trainable, okay? But they have to be trained for those skills that will go up the value chain. Okay? And also at the same time, to give the assurance of investors that we have enough manpower of the skill sets. So there should be, I think this should be work in such a way that there's cooperation between government incentivizing the training and the the European Chamber, evangelizing this message for them to really look at the Philippines, that we have young people. As far as population age is concerned, we have the most attractive ones. We're 24 and 25 below. So this, I hope, would come to a fruition wherein we would be able to train the enough manpower to be taken in on this, more technical jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I think in the end, it requires enlightenment, but most of us here gathered are all converted, and we're all speaking the same language. But we have to go out there and evangelize, as you said, the value of capital, okay, which has no nationality, which just wants to make money, but creates the potential and opportunity for even the youngest and poorest Filipino if we only give it a chance. So I hope we can pursue all of these together, also with our organizers. I think it's a worthy advocacy. Maybe we can leverage the elections and ask them really, how are we going to deal with the pandemic in a realistic and practical way. So looking forward to, I think, a bright future ahead. So to our esteemed and distinguished panelists, thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us. And so this ends our panel, and now we will have our closing remarks. Be none other than our Kuya Mon Lopez, or Super Mon as they call him at DTI. But well, we have a recording, no? So Honorable Ramon Lopez, our Secretary of Trade and Industry, has also come from the private sector and knows very well. I think his main advocacy has always been actually for the small and medium enterprises through his Go Negosyo efforts. So for our closing remarks, we have none other than the Honorable Ramon Lopez.
Thank you, Tony, and a pleasant day to the speakers and participants of today's session. First, let me thank the organizers, Strat-based ADR Institute, for inviting me to give today's closing remarks. To the speakers, thank you for sharing your thoughts on how the Philippines and the EU can further enhance their trade and investment relations to achieve inclusive growth and recovery. For the Philippines, we recognize that the trajectory of one's recovery would highly depend on the policies and programs adopted and implemented in response to the pandemic. And among the critical policies and programs would be keeping the markets open for trade and investments, ensuring the smooth flow of goods and services, our supply chain, effective containment of the pandemic, delivery of mass vaccination, which we are doing, and easing of mobility restrictions. In line with this, we continue to support the call for the reopening of borders and travel, enhanced trade, and the multilateral approach for vaccine production, procurement, and distribution. The Philippines is supportive of these advocacies in all fora, including the ASEAN, the APEC, and the WTO. We have been mentioning all these advocacies. In ASEAN, this includes the finalization and implementation of the ASEAN Travel Corridor Arrangement Framework. In the WTO, this consists of our readiness to engage in text-based discussions on proposals to temporarily waive certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement. This is meant to clarify the scope, duration, and implementation elements of the proposals, as well as addressing trade and health issues in general, to name a few. We see such initiatives as necessary and relevant in facilitating economic recovery while keeping the health and safety of our people in mind. Further on trade and health, the Philippines is supportive of all international efforts that will provide or ensure equitable access to safe, affordable, and effective diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines to contain the COVID-19 pandemic. Given that the pandemic has curtailed economic activities, we have nonetheless observed the acceleration of the digital economy through an intensified utilization of online platforms. We have observed that e-commerce in general is one of the industries that experienced a significant growth against a backdrop of general economic slowdown last year in 2020. As such, the department has been supportive of key international initiatives on digital economy and trade. This includes the acceleration of ASEAN digital transformation through the Bandar Seri Begawan Roadmap, which articulates and concretizes ASEAN's commitment to become a leading digital economy. In particular, we recognize the importance of greater cooperation among countries, in this case with other member states, in supporting the digital economy through a possible digital economic partnership agreement. We believe that engaging in this type of agreement will provide an enabling environment for digital technologies and support our digital capabilities in the region as we look towards the digital era of trade. The Philippines would welcome increased engagement with the EU on this front, given your role as a world leader in this area. We see a lot of complementarities in this exercise, especially that the Philippines is strong in the service sector, such as business services and professional services, the growth of which are directly conducive to the advancement in technologies. Thus, the Philippines has been working to facilitate greater adoption of the digital economy through policy regulations, frameworks. We even issued our e-commerce roadmap. We have done a lot of digitalization of micro SMEs, introducing e-commerce and linking them with known e-commerce platforms, concrete initiatives that empower the stakeholders, capacity building, and even the digitalization of key government services. The Philippine government believes that trade and investment policies must be people-centered and should always promote inclusive growth. We adhere to this policy and together with the EU will remain a strong mover of an open, free, fair, transparent, inclusive, rules-based, and non-discriminatory trading system. As proof of our commitment to establishing a conducive business environment under an open market policy, the Philippine government has introduced several initiatives intended to encourage more investments through tax incentives. These range from lowering the corporate income taxes, especially for micro SMEs, to more tax deductions for businesses, like more years of income tax holidays for eligible businesses. Other legislative reforms are also underway through the amendments of the Retail Trade Liberalization Act, the Public Service Act, and the Foreign Investments Act. The Philippines also views sustainable development as an overarching agenda in all trade engagements. This is because of the need to address not only scarce resources, but the evolving challenges both in production and consumption. We are pleased to note that the EU is also a leader on this front, and we would also welcome closer engagement with the EU in this area, possibly through the resumption of the Philippines-EU Free Trade Agreement, or FTA, negotiations. Looking at the current economic priorities of the Philippines and our efforts towards establishing the country as a hub for manufacturing, innovation, research and development, and a center for training and education in the region, there is a compelling reason for the EU to strengthen ties with the Philippines through a free trade agreement. Notwithstanding discussions for a possible FTA, a core feature of our relations with the EU is the EU Generalized Scheme of Preferences, or GSP+. Since the successful application of the Philippines to the GSP+ in 2014, the Philippines has enjoyed greater market access to EU that led to a significant increase in exports. For 2020, total exports to EU amounted to 6.2 billion euros. In terms of eligible exports, 2.1 billion euros worth of Philippine exports are covered by GSP+, of which 1.6 billion euros availed of GSP+ preferences, or 26% of Philippines' total exports. Likewise, GSP+ utilization grew from 72% in 2019 to an all-time high of 75% in 2020. GSP+ gives an impetus for foreign companies to invest in the Philippines, thereby contributing to employment generation and the developmental goals of the country. These operations cut across a range of industries including electronics, agriculture, processed foods, apparel, craft goods, travel goods, and home appliances. The scheme has been benefiting EU firms as well, as they invest in production facilities in the Philippines, not only to export products to the EU under GSP+ rates, but also to take advantage of the large and growing Philippine domestic market, which is one of the fastest growing in Asia. EU firms also have FTA access to ASEAN and ASEAN partners, as well as the US market under the US GSP. Not to mention that, of course, the goods entering the EU would come in at lower prices. To stabilize this engagement, it may be well to consider now a more secure and predictable business environment through an FTA with the EU. In line with this, Philippines looks forward to working closely with the EU to bring the Philippine-EU trade and investment relations to new heights, strongly promoting sustainable and inclusive growth. Thank you once again to Strat-based ADR Institute, and congratulations on a successful Pilipinas Conference 2021. Maraming salamat po at mabuhay tayong lahat.
Thank you to our Secretary, DTI Secretary Ramon Lopez. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to, I've noticed, nearly 600 participants in the second session of the 2021 Pilipinas Conference. Good day to all. Hope to see you again in session 3 tomorrow as we discuss sustainability and the environment. Good day.